Hey guys, tonight we begin with a little journey back in time. Go ahead and dim the lights, get comfortable under your blankets, and let's explore what your life would actually look like if you had the supreme misfortune of being born a wealthy noblewoman in the late Middle Ages or early modern Europe. Specifically, we are looking at the exact day you find out you are being married off to a total stranger. This isn't a fairy tale. There are no dashing princes on white horses here. Instead, there is a lot of heavy velvet, a very drafty castle, and a future husband who is likely your cousin and has some very questionable teeth. So let's close our eyes, take a deep breath, and drift back to a world of political transactions disguised as romance. You wake up. It is early, far too early, and the air in your bedchamber is so cold you can see your own breath. There are no radiators, no central heating, just a massive stone fireplace at the far end of the room that has spent the last 6 hours slowly dying down to ash. Your bed is surrounded by thick, heavy woolen curtains. They're supposed to keep the drafts out, but they mostly just trap the smell of stale lavender and the dampness of the castle walls. You pull the heavy furs up to your chin, hoping for just 5 more minutes of sleep, but the heavy oak door creaks open. Your ladies-in-waiting enter. They do not look happy to be awake either, but they have a job to do. Today is the day your father has decided to settle his debts, secure a piece of swampy land in Flanders, and seal a peace treaty that will probably be broken in 3 weeks anyway. And you, unfortunately, are the currency. Your ladies begin the long, tedious process of getting you out of bed and into your shift. There are no warm showers here. Instead, you get a shallow basin of lukewarm water, scented with rose water if you are lucky, which is used to splosh your face and hands. The rest of your body is left largely untouched because in the 15th century, bathing too often is widely believed to open your pores to pestilence and bad air. It is a comforting thought to start your day with. Once you are dry, the dressing begins. You are not putting on comfortable sweatpants. You are being squeezed into a linen chemise, followed by a stiff, tightly laced kirtle, and finally a heavy overgown made of yards of imported Italian velvet. It feels like wearing a weighted blanket, but not the comfortable kind. It smells faintly of damp wool and the cedar chests it was stored in to keep the moths away. As they lace you up, one of your ladies begins to work on your hair. High fashion for a noblewoman of this era is, frankly, a bit bizarre. The goal is to look as though you have an enormously high, pale forehead. This means your maids are not just brushing your hair, they are actively plucking your hairline back by about an inch with tweezers. It hurts, of course, but you have to look elegant for the portrait painter who will be arriving later, or worse, for the proxy groom who is coming to stand in for your actual groom. You sit there, wincing silently while they pluck away. You are also not allowed to wear makeup that looks like makeup, but you might get a little lead-based powder to make your skin look fashionably pale, because looking like you've never seen the sun is the ultimate status symbol. If you look like you are about to faint from anemia, you're doing great. Once you are fully dressed, heavy, plucked, and slightly lightheaded, you are escorted down the dark, twisting stone spiral staircase to your father's study. The stairs are uneven, designed that way on purpose to trip up medieval invaders, but today they are mostly just trying to trip you up in your 6-foot train. You arrive at the heavy oak door. Inside, your father is sitting at a massive table covered in maps, wax seals, and half-eaten pieces of salt pork. He doesn't look up immediately. He's busy arguing with a lawyer about the exact boundary of a vineyard in Burgundy. When he finally does look at you, there is no emotional, fatherly moment. He looks at you the way a modern car dealer looks at a reliable mid-sized sedan. You are an asset. You are about to be traded. Your father explains the situation with the dry, business-like tone of a corporate accountant. Your groom is Duke Leopold of some tiny, rain-slicked duchy you've never heard of. He's your second cousin once removed, because of course he is. To keep the land in the family, your father has secured a papal dispensation, which basically means he paid a large sum of money to the Pope to overlook the fact that your family tree is a straight line. Leopold, your groom, your father tells you, is a pious man. In medieval terms, pious is usually code for deeply boring, slightly unhinged, and spends 6 hours a day praying in a cold stone chapel instead of bathing. It's a comforting thought to start your day with. Once your father has informed you of this mildly horrific transaction, the next step is the actual wedding. But remember, life in medieval Europe is super dangerous, and nobody really likes to leave their castle if they can help it. So many royals and nobles didn't actually travel to their own weddings. Instead, they sent a representative, usually a trusted advisor or a younger brother, to stand in for them at the altar. You are led to the castle chapel, which is freezing cold and smells of incense and wet dog. The proxy groom is waiting there. He looks deeply uncomfortable, mostly because he has to pretend to be his boss cross while holding your hand. You stand before the priest, reciting vows in Latin you only half understand, promising to obey a man who is currently 300 miles away, probably feeding his dogs. After the vows, there is a small, incredibly awkward ceremony called the bedding by proxy. To make the marriage legally binding before you actually travel, you and the proxy groom have to climb into a bed together in front of witnesses. Don't worry, it's entirely platonic and highly bureaucratic. You both lie on top of the covers, fully clothed in your heavy velvet finery, while the royal notary watches. The proxy groom slowly places his bare leg under the covers to touch yours. This single, awkward contact of shins legally seals the contract. Everyone applauds. The notary writes it down. You are now officially married to a man you have never seen, and you have just shared a bed with his accountant, because why not make the entire process as weird as humanly possible? Now that you are legally bound, the real fun begins, the journey. You have to leave your home, your family, and everything you have ever known to travel to your new husband's territory. This is not a pleasant road trip. There are no shock absorbers on a 15th century carriage. It's essentially a wooden box suspended by leather straps over massive iron-rimmed wheels. Every bump in the road sends a jolt straight up your spine. The carriage is drafty, the rain pours through the leather curtains, and the roads are little more than rivers of mud. You spend your days staring out the window at the endless gray forests, wondering if your new husband is going to be a monster or just incredibly dull. After 3 weeks of bone-rattling travel, you finally cross the border into your new home. The landscape looks remarkably similar to the one you left, only slightly damp and more depressing. You approach the castle of your new husband. It sits on a rocky crag, looking less like a home and more like a very gray, very hostile military bunker. The walls are black with soot from centuries of torchlight, and the moat is covered in a thick layer of green slime. As your carriage rumbles over the drawbridge, you can hear the baying of dozens of hunting dogs. Your father wasn't lying about the mastiffs. Your carriage stops, the door is opened, and you are helped down into the mud. Standing there to greet you is your husband, Duke Leopold. You take your first look at the man you will spend the rest of your life with. He's called the Fair by his court poets, but as you look at him, you realize that medieval poets were paid very well to lie. He has the classic features of a family that has spent too many generations marrying their own cousins. His jaw is slightly too long, his nose is remarkably prominent, and he's wearing a doublet that looks like it hasn't been brushed since the previous reign. He looks at you with a mixture of mild curiosity and profound indifference, then turns to his master of horse to ask if his favorite hound has finished whelping. It's a fairy tale if your fairy tale is written by a very tired bureaucrat. The wedding feast that evening is a massive, loud, and incredibly greasy affair. The great hall is packed with local nobles who have come to see the new duchess and eat free meat. The noise is deafening, musicians playing lutes out of tune, dogs fighting under the tables for bones, and drunk barons shouting toasts. The food is a testament to medieval excess. There are roasted peacocks served with their feathers stuffed back on to look alive, which makes them look less like food and more like taxidermy. There are massive pies that when cut open release live frogs or small birds, because apparently dinner theater in the Middle Ages was quite literal. The smell of roasted fat, spilled ale, and unwashed bodies fills the room. You sit next to Leopold, who eats in silence, occasionally throwing chunks of mutton to the dogs pacing behind his chair. You try to make conversation, but he only speaks a dialect of German you barely understand, and your Latin is apparently too formal for him. So you both sit there smiling blankly at a room full of people getting progressively drunker. Eventually, the feast winds down, which leads to the actual bedding ceremony. Unlike the proxy version, this one is very real and involves the entire court. In the 15th century, royal and noble marriages were public property. There was no privacy. A crowd of drunken nobles, ladies, and priests escort you and Leopold's to the bridal chamber. Your ladies undress you down to your chemise, while Leopold's squires strip him. You are both placed into the massive bed, surrounded by heavy tapestries depicting tapirs and hunting scenes. The priest steps forward, sprinkles the bed with holy water to ward off demons and ensure fertility, and says a prayer. The crowd then stands around the bed, drinking sweet spiced wine, telling crude jokes, and throwing barley at you for good luck. You just have to lie there, smiling, wishing the floor would open up and swallow you whole. Finally, the curtains are drawn, the crowd leaves, and you are left in the dark with your new husband, his underbite, and the sound of his dogs barking in the courtyard below. Let's float over to another royal disaster, one that actually happened, to show you that this fictional nightmare was very much the reality for many real women. We will travel to Spain in the late 15th century to meet a woman whose arranged marriage went so spectacularly particularly wrong that it lonely. To make matters worse, Philip wasn't there to meet her. He was away on some courtly business, or perhaps just didn't feel like rushing. When they finally did meet, however, something strange happened. Instead of the usual cold, awkward, formal greeting, there was instant, overwhelming physical chemistry. Juana was completely smitten by Philip's charm, and Philip was pleasantly surprised by Juana's beauty. They were so impatient to be together that they actually skipped the formal wedding ceremony and demanded that a local priest marry them on the spot so they could head straight to the bedroom. For a brief moment, it seemed like an arranged marriage miracle, but physical attraction is a very poor foundation for a political alliance, especially when one of the partners is a Habsburg prince who views fidelity as a mild suggestion rather than a vow. Philip quickly went back to his old habits. He loved the court life, the parties, and most of all, other women. He had a string of mistresses, and he didn't particularly care if Juana knew about them. Juana, however, was not the type of medieval wife to quietly accept her husband's affairs. She was deeply, obsessively in love with Philip, and his infidelity drove her to the brink of despair. She would fly into rages, confront his mistresses, and scream at him in front of the court. The Burgundian court, which was used to a certain level of decorum, was horrified by her outbursts. They didn't see a woman reacting to betrayal. They saw a woman losing her mind. Philip, being a classic 16th century husband, decided that the best way to handle his wife's emotional meltdowns was to lock her up. He restricted her access to her money, dismissed her loyal Spanish servants, and kept her isolated in her rooms. Juana responded by going on hunger strikes, refusing to sleep and pacing her chambers for hours. The relationship turned into a toxic cycle of brief, passionate reconciliations followed by long periods of psychological warfare. Then, fate intervened in the most complicated way possible. Back in Spain, Juana's older siblings and their children began dying off in rapid succession. Suddenly, Juana went from being a minor Spanish infanta living in Flanders to the sole heir to the crowns of Castile and Aragon. This changed everything. Philip, who had previously just viewed Juana as an annoying, dramatic wife, now saw her as his ticket to becoming a king. When Isabella of Castile died in 2004, Juana became the Queen of Castile. But Isabella, who had watched her daughter's mental state deteriorate from afar, had written a very specific will. She stated that if Juana was unwilling or unable to rule, her father, Ferdinand, should act as regent. This set off a massive three-way power struggle between Juana's husband, Philip, who wanted the crown for himself, Juana's father, Ferdinand, who didn't want to give up control of Castile, and Juana herself, who was caught in the middle. Philip and Ferdinand both had the same strategy: convince the world that Juana was completely insane so they could rule in her name. Philip took Juana back to Spain to claim the throne, but the tension between him and Ferdinand was thick enough to cut with a broadsword. Juana was forced to choose between her father and her husband. Because she was still deeply, tragically in love with Philip, she chose him. But Philip's triumph was brief-lived. In September of 1506, after playing a game of pelota, he drank a glass of ice-cold water, fell suddenly ill with a fever, and died a few days later. He was only 28. There were rumors of poison, of course, because why not add a little murder mystery to the drama? Philip's death was the final blow to Juana's fragile mental state. Her grief was monumental, theatrical, and deeply unsettling. She refused to leave his body. She had him embalmed and placed in a lead coffin. When she had to travel across Spain to take him to his burial site in Granada, she insisted on traveling only at night because a widow who has lost the son of her life should not be seen in the daylight. The funeral procession was a gothic nightmare. Juana, heavily pregnant with her 6th child, traveled with a court of mourning nobles, priests, and guards, slowly carting Philip's coffin through the cold Spanish nights. She would periodically stop the procession, open the coffin, and kiss her dead husband's feet to make sure he was still there. She also banned any women from coming near the coffin, convinced that even in death, Philip's spirit might wander off with a pretty court lady. Eventually, her father Ferdinand decided he had had enough of this macabre parade. He seized control of Castile, took Juana, and locked her away in the castle of Tordesillas. She was placed in a windowless room, stripped of her royal status, and kept in isolation. Her father ruled Castile in her name. When Ferdinand died, Juana's own son, Charles V, took over. But instead of releasing her mother, Charles decided that a locked-up mad mother was much easier to manage than an active queen. He kept her in Tordesillas for the rest of her life. Juana spent 46 years in that drafty, dark castle, wearing rags, refusing to wash or eat properly, and staring at the walls. She died in 1555 at the age of 75. She had been a queen on paper for over half a century, but she spent almost all of it as a prisoner of the men who claimed to love her, or at least loved her crown. Let's drift over to another royal marriage that went genetically and personally wrong, this time in the cold, rain-swept courts of England and Scotland. Imagine being a young princess, growing up in the sunny, elegant courts of France, only to be told that you are being sent to Scotland, a place that in the 16th century was viewed by the French as a cold, muddy wasteland, populated by wild clansmen who liked to stab each other. This was the fate of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was actually born Queen of Scotland. Her father died when she was just 6 days old, but she was sent to France to be raised in luxury and safety. She was tall, beautiful, highly educated, and absolute royalty. She married the Dauphin of France, Francis II, and briefly became the Queen of France. But Francis was a sickly, frail boy who looked like he was made of wet paper. He died of an ear infection after just a year on the throne, leaving Mary a teenage widow. With no future in France, Mary had to return to Scotland to actually rule. She arrived in Leith in 1561 in a thick fog and immediately realized that Scotland was not France. The nobles were rebellious, the Protestant reformers hated her Catholic faith, and everyone was looking for a way to control her. The biggest question on everyone's mind was who would she marry next? Mary needed a husband who could help her secure her throne and, ideally, strengthen her claim to the throne of England, which was currently occupied by her cousin Elizabeth I. Enter Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Darnley was Mary's cousin. He was tall, handsome, athletic, and had a claim to both the Scottish and English thrones. On paper, he looked like the perfect match. Mary fell head over heels for him. She described him as the lustiest and best proportioned long man she had ever seen. They were married in July of 1565, but as Mary quickly discovered, being a long man does not make one a good husband or a competent king. Darnley was, to put it mildly, an absolute nightmare. He was spoiled, arrogant, vain, and had a severe drinking problem. He didn't want to be the king consort. He wanted the crown matrimonial, which would give him equal power to Mary and allow him to rule if she died. Mary, realizing that Darnley had the political intelligence of a damp turnip, refused. Darnley did not take this well. He began spending his nights drinking in the taverns of Edinburgh, getting into fights, and plotting against his own wife. The situation came to a head with the murder of David Rizzio. Rizzio was Mary's private secretary, a talented Italian musician who had become her closest advisor and friend. Darnley, encouraged by a group of Protestant nobles who hated Rizzio, became convinced that Mary and Rizzio were having an affair. This was highly unlikely, but Darnley was insecure and easily manipulated. On the night of March 9, 1566, Mary, who was 6 months pregnant, was having a small dinner party in private chambers at Holyrood Palace. Suddenly, Darnley and a group of armed nobles burst into the room. They dragged Rizzio away from the screaming queen, who tried to protect him and stabbed him 56 times right outside her door. They then kept Mary hostage in her own palace. It was a brutal, terrifying move, but Mary was far smarter than her husband. She managed to convince Darnley that the other nobles were going to betray him too. She played on his vanity and fear, and together they escaped down a secret staircase, rode through the night to safety, and raised an army to crush the conspirators. But Mary could never forgive Darnley for what he had done. She had their son, the future James VI of Scotland and first of England, but the marriage was completely dead. Darnley was now a political liability and a personal threat. In early 1567, Darnley fell ill with smallpox, or possibly syphilis, which wouldn't be surprising given his lifestyle. Mary had him moved to a small, quiet house called Kirk O' Field, just outside Edinburgh, ostensibly so he could recover away from the baby. She visited him regularly, and it seemed like they might be reconciling, but on the night of February 9, 1567, Mary left Kirk O' Field to attend a wedding dance at Holyrood Palace. A few hours later, at 2 in the morning, a massive explosion shook Edinburgh. Kirk O' Field had been hacked with gunpowder and blown to pieces. When the dust cleared, Darnley's body was found in the garden. Strangely, he had not been killed by the explosion. He was lying under a tree, dressed only in his nightshirt, with no burn marks on his body. He had been smothered to death, along with his page, as they tried to escape the house. The murder of Darnley remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Most people suspected James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, a powerful and ambitious noble who had become Mary's chief protector, but the scandal got infinitely worse when, just a few months after the murder, Mary married Bothwell. This was the ultimate political disaster. To the Scottish people and the rest of Europe, it looked like Mary had conspired with her lover to murder her husband. The Protestant nobles rose in rebellion. Mary's army deserted her, and she was forced to abdicate her throne. She spent the next 19 years imprisoned in various English castles before Elizabeth I finally had her executed for treason. Mary's quest for a handsome husband cost her her crown, her freedom, and eventually her head. Let's float away from the damp, dangerous castles of Scotland and cross the English Channel to France, where we can look at a royal marriage that was less bloody, but infinitely more awkward and bizarre. Let's meet Louis XVI of France and his young Austrian bride, Marie Antoinette. The year is 1770. France and Austria, two traditional enemies, have decided to make peace. To seal the deal, they arrange a marriage between the 15-year-old French Dauphin, Louis, and the 14-year-old Austrian Archduchess, Maria Antoinette, who would become known as Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette was a typical product of the Habsburg court, charming, lively, fond of music and dancing, and completely unprepared for the bizarre, stifling etiquette of Versailles. Louis, on the other hand, was a deeply awkward, shy, and introverted boy. He hated the court, hated dancing, and preferred to spend his time lockpicking, metalworking, and hunting. He was called the Dauphin, but he had the social grace of a wet sponge. When the young couple met, it was a clash of two completely incompatible personalities. Marie Antoinette was expecting a glamorous, romantic French prince. Instead, she got a boy who mumbled, avoided eye contact, and went to bed at 9 every night. The wedding at Versailles was one of the most lavish events of the century. There were thousands of guests, miles of silk, and enough fireworks to light up the night sky for hours. But the real drama began after the party in the royal bedroom. In France, the primary duty of a royal bride was to produce a male heir as quickly as possible. The entire court was waiting. The next morning, the courtiers gathered to check the royal sheets for proof that the marriage had been consummated. There was nothing. This wouldn't have been a big deal for a few days or even a few weeks, but days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. For 7 long years, Louis and Marie Antoinette lived together as husband and wife without actually consummating their marriage. This was a major diplomatic crisis. The French court whispered that the king was impotent. The Austrian Empress, Maria Antoinette's formidable mother, Maria Theresa, sent constant, anxious letters demanding to know why her daughter hadn't gotten pregnant yet. Marie Antoinette was humiliated, and Louis was deeply embarrassed. So what was the problem? For a long time, historians believed that Louis suffered from a physical condition called phimosis, which made intercourse extremely painful, and that he needed a minor surgical operation to fix it. However, modern research suggests the issue was much simpler. Louis was incredibly uneducated about the mechanics of reproduction, and he was too shy and anxious to ask for help. He was essentially a confused teenager who didn't know what to do and was terrified of failing in front of his wife and his court. The situation became so dire that Marie Antoinette's brother, the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, decided to personally intervene. He traveled to France in disguise to have a man-to-man chat with his brother-in-law. Joseph, who was a very practical and no-nonsense man, sat Louis down and explained the facts of life in very blunt, geometric terms. He wrote back to his mother that Louis was a good fellow but completely ignorant, and that he had explained to him exactly what he needed to do. The intervention worked. In August of 1777, 7 years after their wedding, the marriage was finally consummated. Louis wrote a triumphant note in his diary, and Marie Antoinette wrote to her mother that she was in the most essential happiness. They went on to have 4 children, but the damage to their reputation had already been done. The 7 years of childlessness had allowed the French public to paint Marie Antoinette as a foreign, Austrian woman who was incapable of producing heirs, and Louis as a weak, useless husband. This reputation would follow them all the way to the guillotine during the French Revolution. Let's float away from the damp, dangerous castles of Scotland and cross the English Channel to France, where we can look at a royal marriage that was less bloody but infinitely more dysfunctional and tragic, this time in the grand imperial courts of Russia. Tonight, let's look at the tragic, dysfunctional life Peter III of Russia and his wife, who would go on to become Catherine the Great. In 1745, a young German princess named Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst was chosen by the Empress Elizabeth of of Russia to marry her nephew and heir, Peter of Holstein-Gottorp. Sophie was intelligent, ambitious, and determined to make a success of her new life in Russia. She changed her name to Catherine, learned Russian, converted to the Orthodox Church, and did everything she could to please the Empress. Peter, on the other hand, was an absolute disaster. He had been born in Germany and despised everything about Russia. He hated the language, hated the religion, and hated the people. He was obsessed with Frederick the Great of Prussia, Russia's chief rival, and liked to dress up in Prussian military uniforms and parade his servants around like soldiers. But Peter's quirks went far beyond military roleplay. He was childish, intellectually stunted, and had some very strange habits. He was obsessed with toy soldiers. He would spend hours lining up wax and wooden soldiers on his bed, staging elaborate battles. If his wife came into the room, he would force her to stand guard or play along. Catherine, who was reading Voltaire and Montesquieu, found this incredibly tiresome, because why wouldn't she? Peter's obsession with toys took a dark, absurd turn one afternoon. Catherine walked into his chambers to find a dead rat hanging from a tiny custom-made gallows on his desk. When she asked him what on earth he was doing, Peter explained in all seriousness that the rat had committed a crime. It had climbed onto his toy fortress and eaten 2 of his wax soldiers. Peter had held a full court-martial, found the rat guilty of treason, and sentenced it to death by hanging. He was 25 years old. Like Louis XVI, Peter also had no interest in consummating his marriage. He preferred to spend his nights playing with his toys, drinking beer, and training his hunting dogs in the bedroom. He would actually keep a pack of dogs in his chambers, which made the room smell like a kennel and ensured that any romantic atmosphere was thoroughly destroyed. Catherine spent 9 years as a virgin wife, trapped in a cold marriage with a man who court-martialed rodents. Eventually, Catherine decided she had had enough. She knew that to survive in the brutal Russian court, she needed to produce an heir. So she took a lover, a handsome Russian nobleman named Sergei Saltykov. When Catherine finally gave birth to a son, the future Paul I, Peter publicly claimed the child was his, but privately muttered that he didn't understand how his wife kept getting pregnant. When the Empress Elizabeth died in 1762, Peter became Emperor Peter III. He immediately proceeded to alienate everyone in Russia. He ended the war with Prussia just as Russia was about to win and gave back all the conquered land because he was still a massive Frederick the Great fanboy. He also threatened to divorce Catherine and lock her up in a convent. This was a massive mistake. Catherine was far more popular than Peter, and she had the support of the army and the nobles. In July of 1762, after just 6 months on the throne, Catherine wore a military uniform, mounted a horse, and led a coup against her husband. Peter was arrested, forced to abdicate, and taken to a quiet country estate. A few days later, Peter was killed in a drunken brawl with his guards, or more likely, quietly strangled on Catherine's orders. Catherine went on to rule Russia for 34 years as Catherine the Great, proving that sometimes the best way to handle an arranged marriage is to simply overthrow your husband and run the country yourself. Let's drift over to Spain, where the Habsburg family tree had become so tangled that it practically choked itself out of existence. Tonight, let's look at the ultimate warning tale of royal inbreeding, Charles II of Spain. By the late 17th century, the Spanish Habsburgs had spent nearly 200 years marrying their own close relatives. They believed that only Habsburg blood was pure enough to rule Spain, so uncles married nieces and cousins married cousins over and over again. To give you an idea of how bad this was, a normal person has 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and 16 great-great-grandparents. Charles II, who was born in 1661, had only 4 great-grandparents. His inbreeding coefficient was actually higher than if his parents had been brother and sister. Charles was called the Bewitched by his subjects, who believed his physical and mental disabilities were the result of black magic. In reality, it was just terrible genetics. He was born with a jaw so oversized, the famous Habsburg jaw, that his lower teeth did not touch his upper teeth. This meant he couldn't chew his food and had to swallow it whole, which led to constant, severe digestive issues. He also had a tongue so large that he drooled constantly and could barely speak. He didn't learn to walk until he was 8 years old and was never fully educated. He was bald, frail, and suffered from constant illnesses. His mind was childish and simple. His favorite activity was playing games in the palace courtyard. But because he was the only surviving male heir to the Spanish Empire, he was the king, and he had to be married. The Spanish court arranged a marriage between Charles and Marie-Louise of Orleans, a beautiful young French princess who who was the niece of Louis XIV. Marie-Louise was horrified when she found out she was being sent to Spain to marry a man who could barely walk and drooled constantly. She cried for days before her departure. When they met, Charles fell in love with her. He was sweet to her in his own childish way, and Marie-Louise, to her credit, tried her best to be a good wife. But the marriage was a genetic impossibility. Charles was impotent and sterile, the final broken link in a long chain of inbred royals. Marie-Louise spent 10 miserable, lonely years in the stifling, rigid Spanish court, where she was watched constantly by strict dueñas. She gained weight, became depressed, and eventually died suddenly at the age of 26, possibly from appendicitis or poison. Charles was devastated by her death, but the Spanish Empire still needed an heir, so his advisors immediately married him off again, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg. Maria Anna was a tough, ambitious German princess who quickly realized that Charles was incapable of fathering a child. She spent her time dominating the court, arguing with Charles's mother, and trying to secure the Spanish succession for her own family. Charles's health rapidly declined. He suffered from hallucinations, spasms, and became completely senile in his late 30s. He died in 1700 at the age of 38, leaving no children. The autopsy of Charles II is one of the most bizarre medical documents in history. The royal doctor wrote that Charles's body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, and his skull was entirely full of water. With his death, the Spanish Habsburg line came to an end, sparking a massive, bloody war of succession that dragged on for 13 years. The family that had spent centuries marrying each other to protect their empire ended up destroying it through sheer stubborn genetics. Let's float over to a less tragic but equally strange royal marriage, this time involving the tea-loving princess of Portugal and the merry monarch of England. Let's meet Catherine of Braganza and King Charles II of England. In 1662, England had just restored its monarchy after years of Puritan rule under Oliver Cromwell. The newly crowned King Charles II was charming, athletic, loved dogs, especially spaniels, and loved women even more. He was known as the Merry Monarch, and his court was a wild, decadent party. To help pay off his massive debts, Charles decided to marry Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess. Catherine came with an enormous dowry, which included 2 million Portuguese crowns, the port cities of Tangier and Bombay, and the right to trade freely with the Portuguese colonies. It was a massive financial win for England, but Catherine herself was completely unprepared for the English court. She had been raised in a strict, quiet convent in Portugal. She spoke no English, wore an old-fashioned, stiff Portuguese dress with a giant hoop skirt that made her look like a belle, and had a very modest, quiet personality. When she arrived in England, Charles was polite, but his court was less than welcoming. The elegant English ladies laughed at her dress, her hair, and her quiet manners. But the real insult came from Charles's chief mistress, Barbara Palmer, the Countess of Castleman. Barbara was a stunning, ambitious, and temperamental woman who had already given Charles several children. She ruled the court, and she had no intention of letting the new queen take her place. To show his wife who really was in charge, Charles insisted on appointing Barbara as Catherine's Lady of the Bedchamber. This was an incredible insult. It meant that Catherine's chief servant, the woman who would help her dress and attend to her daily needs, was her husband's highly public mistress. Catherine refused. She crossed Barbara's name off the list. Charles, because why not double down on being a terrible husband, insisted. He sent Catherine's Portuguese servants back to Portugal, leaving her isolated and friendless in a foreign court. Catherine fainted from stress during their first argument about Barbara, her nose bleeding from the tension. But Charles was stubborn. He wore her down until she finally had no choice but to accept Barbara as her servant. Despite this incredibly rocky start, Catherine eventually found her footing. She started dressing in the French style, learned to ride horses, and even started to tolerate Charles's endless string of mistresses. She also introduced a small domestic habit to the English court that would go on to define British culture: drinking tea. At the time, tea was a rare, expensive luxury in England, mostly used as medicine. Catherine, who drank it daily in Portugal, made it the fashionable drink of the royal court. Suddenly, every noble lady wanted to drink tea out of delicate porcelain cups, just like the queen. But while Catherine was popular with the public, she had one major flaw in the eyes of court. She couldn't have children. She suffered several miscarriages, but never managed to produce an heir. This was a massive political problem, as Charles's brother and heir, James, was a devout Catholic, which the Protestant Parliament absolutely hated. Many politicians urged Charles
to divorce Catherine and marry a Protestant woman who could give him heirs. But Charles, despite being a deeply unfaithful husband, had a code of honor. He refused to abandon Catherine. He told his ministers that he would not reward her for her quiet dignity by throwing her aside, and he protected her from anti-Catholic plots for the rest of his life.
When Charles died in 1685, Catherine returned to Portugal, where she eventually served as regent and died in 1705. She never got the romantic, faithful husband she deserved, but she did leave the British with their favorite drink, which is a pretty impressive legacy. Let's float over to another royal marriage that went genetically wrong, this time in the grand imperial courts of late 19th century Europe, where a hidden genetic killer was waiting to strike. Tonight, let's look at the tragic story of Alice of the United Kingdom and her daughter, Alex of Hesse, who would become the last Tsarina of Russia. Alice was the daughter of Queen Victoria of England. Victoria was a powerful, long-ruling monarch, but she was also the carrier of a deadly genetic mutation, hemophilia. Hemophilia is a rare blood disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. A minor cut can lead to internal bleeding, and a simple bruise can be fatal. Because of the way the gene is inherited, women are usually carriers, while men are the ones who suffer from the disease. Victoria passed the gene to several of her children, who then married into royal families across Europe, spreading the royal disease like a ticking genetic time bomb. Alice married Louis IV, the Grand Duke of Hesse, and passed the gene to her daughter, Alex. Alex was beautiful, quiet, and deeply religious. She caught the eye of Nicholas Romanov, the heir to the Russian throne. The match was a love story, which was rare for royals. They were deeply, genuinely in love with each other. But Nicholas's father, Tsar Alexander III, didn't approve of the marriage, and Alex was hesitant to convert to the Russian Orthodox faith. But when Alexander III died suddenly in 1894, Nicholas became Tsar, and he immediately married Alex, who took the name Alexandra Fyodorovna. Alexandra was not popular in Russia. She was shy, cold, and hated the loud, gossipy St. Petersburg society. She preferred to stay in her palace, focusing on her family and praying for a son. She gave birth to 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, before finally, in 1904, giving birth to a boy, Alexei. The Russian Empire celebrated. Nicholas and Alexandra were overjoyed, but their happiness was short-lived. Within weeks of his birth, Alexei began to bleed uncontrollably from his navel. The royal doctors diagnosed him hemophilia. Alexandra was devastated. She knew that she was the one who had passed this terrible, fatal disease to her only son. The guilt drove her to the brink of madness. Every time Alexei fell or bumped his knee, he would suffer from agonizing internal bleeding that would last for weeks. The royal family kept the disease a state secret, terrified that the Russian public would find out the heir to the throne was a sickly, frail boy who might not survive to adulthood. This secrecy and desperation led Alexandra into the arms of Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was a wild-eyed, unwashed peasant from Siberia who claimed to have holy healing powers. Strangely, whenever Alexei had a bleeding episode, Rasputin would pray over him and the bleeding would stop. Modern historians believe Rasputin's calming presence lowered the boy's blood pressure, or perhaps he simply told the doctors to stop giving Alexei aspirin, which actually thins the blood and made the bleeding worse. Whatever the reason, Alexandra became completely dependent on Rasputin. She viewed him as a savior sent by God to protect her son. But to the Russian public, it looked like a crazy foreign Tsarina was allowing a creepy, corrupt peasant to run the country. Rasputin's influence over the royal family destroyed their credibility, fueling the anger and resentment that would lead to the Russian Revolution. In 1918, the entire royal family, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 4 daughters, and the 14-year-old Alexei, were executed by the Bolsheviks in a dark cellar at Ekaterinburg. The genetic curse of Queen Victoria had not only claimed the life of her great-grandson, but it helped to bring down a 300-year-old dynasty. Let's float back to a time of simpler but no less awkward dynastic weirdness, this time in the medieval courts of France. Tonight, let's look at the bizarre marital career of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was one of the wealthiest and most powerful women of the Middle Ages. She was the Duchess of Aquitaine, a massive, fertile region of southern France that was larger and richer than the lands owned by the King of France himself. She was beautiful, highly educated, spirited, and incredibly wealthy. Naturally, she was the ultimate prize in the medieval marriage market. In 1137, at the age of 15, she was married to Louis VII of France. Louis was a gentle, pious, and deeply boring boy. He'd been raised to be a priest and only became the heir to the throne when his older brother died in a bizarre accident involving a runaway pig on the streets of Paris. Louis loved Eleanor, but he was terrified of her. She was lively,
Italy, loved poetry and courtly love, and found the damp, cold French court in Paris incredibly dull. She famously complained that she'd married a monk, not a king. The marriage was a disaster from start to finish. They went on the Second Crusade together, which was a military catastrophe. Eleanor traveled with a massive train of ladies, luggage, and poets, which did not go down well with the religious soldiers. During the crusade, Eleanor got into a massive public argument with Louis about military strategy. She wanted to support her handsome uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, while Louis wanted to head straight to Jerusalem. To get her way, Eleanor declared that their marriage was invalid because they were distant cousins. Louis was humiliated. He forced her to accompany him to Jerusalem anyway, but the relationship was permanently broken. When they returned to France, they had only produced 2 daughters. In the medieval world, this was a failure. So, in 1152, they officially annulled their marriage on the grounds of consanguinity, the very cousin excuse Eleanor had used during the Crusade. Eleanor got her lands back, which made her a highly eligible bachelorette once again. She didn't stay single long. Just 8 weeks after her divorce, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, the Duke of Normandy and future King of England. Henry was 11 years younger than Eleanor. He was athletic, red-headed, quick-tempered, and incredibly ambitious. The marriage was a massive political coup. Together, Eleanor and Henry ruled an empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, known as the Angevin Empire. Unlike her marriage to the monk-like Louis, Eleanor's marriage to Henry was passionate, stormy, and highly productive. They had 8 children together, including 5 sons. But Henry was just as stubborn and ambitious as Eleanor. He had endless affairs, and he refused to give Eleanor any real political power in her own duchy of Aquitaine. So, Eleanor did what any powerful, disgruntled medieval queen would do. She encouraged her sons to rebel against her father. In 1173, Eleanor's 3 oldest sons rose in rebellion against Henry, supported by their mother. The rebellion failed, and Henry captured Eleanor as she was trying to escape to Paris dressed as a man. Henry didn't execute her, but he locked her up. Eleanor spent the next 16 years imprisoned in various English castles, allowed out only for Christmas. When Henry finally died in 1889, Eleanor's favorite son, Richard the Lionheart, became king. He immediately released his mother, who went on to rule England as regent while Richard was away on the Crusades.
Eleanor lived to the ripe old age of 82, outliving almost all of her children and proving that a powerful noblewoman could survive 2 bad marriages, 16 years in prison, and still end up running the show. Let's float over to another royal marriage that was ruined by a mother-in-law of legendary proportions. Tonight, let's talk about Margaret of Anjou, the Red Queen of England. In 1445, 15-year-old Margaret was married to King Henry VI of England. Henry was a gentle, quiet, and deeply religious man who suffered from severe mental illness. He was prone to periods of complete catatonia, where he would sit for months, unable to speak, walk, or recognize anyone. Margaret, who was fierce, intelligent, and highly capable, had to take control of the government to protect her husband's throne. This set off the bloody civil war, known as the Wars of the Roses. But Margaret's real problems began when her son, Edward of Westminster, was born. Because of Henry's mental illness, many nobles claimed that the child was not his. The chief rebel, Richard, Duke of York, claimed that Margaret had slept with one of her loyal dukes to get a baby. Margaret fought like a lioness to protect her son's inheritance. She raised armies, negotiated alliances, and became the de facto leader of the Lancastrian cause. She was called the Red Queen by her enemies, who painted her as a ruthless, bloodthirsty monster. In reality, she was just a mother trying to protect her child in a world that wanted to destroy him. The war was brutal and dragged on for years. In 1471, Margaret's army was finally defeated at the Battle of Tewkesbury. During the battle, her 17-year-old son, Edward, was killed. Henry VI was captured and murdered in the Tower of London shortly after. Margaret was imprisoned, her spirit completely broken. She was eventually ransomed by the King of France, but she spent the rest of her life in poverty and exile, a queen who had lost everything she had fought so hard to protect. Let's float over to one last royal disaster, this time in the elegant, tragic courts of 19th century Austria. Tonight, let's look at Empress Elizabeth of Austria, famously known as Sisi. Sisi was born into the royal family of Bavaria. She grew up in a very relaxed, informal environment, spending her days riding horses, climbing mountains, and running wild in the Bavarian countryside. In 1853, the young Emperor of Austria, Franz Joseph, was supposed to marry Sisi's older sister Helene, but when the family met, the 23-year-old Franz Joseph fell completely obsessed obsessively in love with Sisi instead. He refused to marry Helene and demanded Sisi's hand in marriage. Sisi was not asked if she wanted to be the empress of one of the largest empires in Europe. She was simply told she was getting married. The transition from her wild, free Bavarian childhood to the rigid, stifling court of Vienna was an absolute disaster for Sisi. The Viennese court was dominated by Franz Joseph's formidable mother, Archduchess Sophie. Sophie believed that Sisi was a spoiled, uneducated child who needed to be broken in. Sophie took control of Sisi's life. She chose her servants, monitored her daily schedule, and when Sisi gave birth to her first 3 children, Sophie took them away immediately, claiming that Sisi was too young and foolish to raise them. Sisi was devastated and fell into a deep depression. She developed severe eating disorders, refusing to eat anything but beef broth and orange juice, and became obsessed with her weight and beauty. She had legendary floor-length chestnut hair that took 3 hours a day to brush and style. She had gym equipment installed in her royal apartments and spent hours exercising every day, walking at a grueling pace that left her ladies-in-waiting exhausted. To escape her husband's overbearing mother and the suffocating court, Sisi spent most of her life traveling. She bought a massive luxury yacht and sailed the Mediterranean, lived in a custom-built villa in Greece, and spent months riding horses in England and Ireland. Franz Joseph loved her deeply and tolerated her endless travels, writing her sweet, lonely letters, but Sisi could never find peace. Her tragedy reached its peak in 1889 when her only son and heir to the throne, Crown Prince Rudolf, was found dead in a hunting lodge at Meyerland alongside his teenage mistress in an apparent murder-suicide. Sisi never recovered from her son's death. She wore black for the rest of her life, withdrew completely from society, and traveled under an assumed name. In 1898, while walking along the promenade in Geneva, Switzerland, Sisi was stabbed in the chest by an Italian anarchist with a sharpened file. She was 60 years old. She had spent her life trying to escape the golden cage of her arranged marriage, only to find that the only way out was a tragic, sudden end. So, as we drift off to sleep tonight, let's be glad that we are warm in our beds, with no proxy weddings to endure, no genetic curses to worry about, and no rat court-martials to attend. Sweet dreams.
I hope you are feeling cozy, that your blanket is adjusted just right, and that you are ready to slide back into the wonderfully awkward, slightly dusty pages of history. Tonight, we are going to continue our gentle glide through the absolute disasters of royal domestic life. If you thought the couples we talked about in our first journey had it rough, wait until you meet the ones who didn't just tolerate each other with gritted teeth, but who actively, enthusiastically, and publicly despised the very ground the other walked on. For our first stop, let's float over to late 18th century England, where we will meet a couple whose mutual repulsion was so spectacular it turned the entire British Empire into a massive, gossipy court. Let's talk about George, Prince of Wales, famously known to his friends, his creditors, and a highly amused public as Prinny. By the year 1794, George was 32 years old, and he was, to put it mildly, an absolute mess. He was incredibly handsome in his youth, but decades of drinking cherry brandy, eating massive multi-course meals, and avoiding any form of physical exercise had left him remarkably soft and fat. He was also buried under a mountain of debt. He owed his creditors over £630,000, a staggering sum of money that in today's currency would be worth tens of millions of dollars. His father, King George III, who was already dealing with his own mental health issues, and the British Parliament, gave him a very simple, very bleak ultimatum. If you want us to pay off your debts, you have to break up with your mistresses, ignore the fact that you secretly and illegally married a Catholic widow named Maria Fitzherbert, and marry a nice, suitable Protestant German princess. George, with his elegantly tailored back to the wall, agreed. He didn't really care who the princess was, as long as the money arrived. So his advisors looked around and settled on his first cousin, Princess Caroline of Brunswick. Caroline was 26 years old, and on paper, she seemed fine, but the diplomats sent to fetch her from Germany Germany, the Earl of Malmesbury, had some immediate, deeply concerning reservations. He wrote in his diary that while Caroline had a reasonably pretty face and a cheerful disposition, her personal habits were, well, lacking. Specifically, Caroline did not believe in washing. She rarely changed her undergarments, wore coarse petticoats that were never properly laundered, and possessed a body odor that was described as offensive. Malmesbury actually had to sit the princess down and, as politely as a British lord could, explain to her that the Prince of Wales was incredibly fastidious about his clothes and his scent, and that she really, truly needed to start taking regular baths and changing her shifts. Caroline apparently listened, but she didn't seem to take the advice to heart. In April of 1795, Caroline arrived in London. The first meeting between the future King and Queen of England is legendary for how instantly, spectacularly wrong it went. George walked into the room, took one look at his new bride, and embraced her as royal etiquette demanded. But as he got close, the reality of her personal hygiene hit him. He recoiled, walked to the far end of the room, and turned to Lord Malmesbury. "Harris," the prince gasped, "I am not very well. Pray get me a glass of brandy." He then fled the room, leaving his new bride standing there, completely bewildered. Caroline was not particularly impressed either. She looked at George and remarked in her thick German accent that he was much older and much fatter than his flattering portraits had led her to believe. She also found his manners cold and his fastidious nature incredibly annoying. It was indeed a match made in a very expensive, very damp version of hell. George spent the next 3 days in a state of absolute panic, drinking brandy almost non-stop to numb the reality of what he had promised to do. By the evening of their wedding on April 8th, he was so spectacularly drunk that he could barely stand. During the ceremony at the Chapel Royal, he staggered and had to be physically propped up by his groomsmen. He spent the entire service looking not at his new wife, but at his favorite mistress, Lady Jersey, who was standing in the crowd, probably enjoying the show immensely. At one point, George actually tried to walk out of the chapel in the middle of the vows, and his father, the king, had to step forward and gently but firmly guide him back to the altar. The wedding night was no better. George was so deeply intoxicated that when they retired to the bridal chamber, he collapsed onto the floor. He ended up spending his very first night as a married man sleeping in a heap under the fireplace grate. Caroline, showing a remarkable amount of practical common sense, simply left him there to sleep it off, got into the massive bed, and went to sleep. Miraculously, despite the brandy, the fireplace, and the complete lack of mutual affection, the marriage was consummated over the next few days. 9 months later, in January of 1796, Caroline gave birth to a daughter, Princess Charlotte. As soon as the baby was born, George decided his duty to the state was officially done. He immediately packed his bags and moved out. He sent Caroline a formal, incredibly cold letter stating that they would never live together again, and even if their daughter died, they would never, under any circumstances, share a bed. He told her she was free to do whatever she liked as long as she didn't do it in his house. Caroline took him at his word. She moved into a separate villa in Blackheath and began living a life that was as eccentric and loud as her husband's. She threw wild parties, flirted openly with politicians, and adopted a parade of local orphan children because why not add some chaotic maternal energy to the mix? George, who was furious that his wife was enjoying her freedom, became convinced that Caroline was having affairs and that one of her adopted children, a baby boy named William Austin, was actually her own illegitimate son. He launched a secret government inquiry called the Delicate Investigation to prove her adultery. They interviewed her servants, searched her rooms, and examined her laundry, but in the end, the investigators had to admit there was no real proof of anything other than Caroline being incredibly flirtatious and terribly messy. By 1814, Caroline had grown tired of the constant surveillance, so she decided to leave England and travel through Europe. Her travels were a constant embarrassment for the British royal family. She traveled in a carriage shaped like a seashell, wore skimpy, low-cut dresses that shocked the local conservative courts, and took a handsome Italian courier named Bartolomeo Pergami as her constant companion. She traveled to Jerusalem, slept in tents, and behaved more like a wealthy, eccentric tourist than a future queen of Great Britain. Then, in 2020, King George III died. George, the Prince Regent, was now King George IV, and that meant
meant Caroline, whether he liked it or not, was officially the Queen Consort of England. George was absolutely desperate to prevent her from being crowned. He offered her a massive pension of £50,000 a year if she would just stay in Europe and never call herself queen. Caroline refused. She boarded a ship and sailed straight back to England, where she was greeted by cheering crowds of ordinary citizens who viewed her as a victim of a cruel, hypocritical, and incredibly fat king. George responded by introducing the Pains and Penalties Bill to Parliament, a legal attempt to divorce Caroline on the grounds of her adultery with Pergami and to strip her of her title of queen. The trial was the sensation of the century. The public sat glued to their newspapers as the king's lawyers presented Italian servants who testified about Caroline's intimate behavior. But the British public saw right through it. They knew the king was a serial adulterer himself, and they rallied behind Caroline, throwing rocks at the king's carriage whenever he showed his face in public. Ultimately, the bill failed. Caroline was still the queen, but George was determined to have the last laugh at his coronation in July of 2021. The coronation was the most expensive, lavish event in British history. George designed a custom, highly theatrical outfit for himself, complete with a massive hat covered in feathers. But his main concern was keeping Caroline out. He ordered all the doors of Westminster Abbey to be locked and guarded by professional prize-fighters dressed as palace pages. Caroline arrived at the Abbey in her carriage. She walked up to the doors, demanding to be let in. The guards refused. She ran from door to door, banging on the heavy oak, shouting that she was the Queen of England. The crowds watched in silent embarrassment as the Queen of the realm was physically barred from her big day. Defeated and humiliated, Caroline homed. The stress of the trial, the public lockout, and years of heavy drinking took their toll. Just 19 days after the coronation, she fell suddenly ill and died at the age of 53. In her will, she requested that her coffin be marked with the words, "Here lies Caroline, the injured Queen of England." Even in death, she wanted to make sure George knew exactly what she thought of him. Let's float over to another royal marriage, one that was less loud and public, but infinitely more tragic and politically chaotic. We will travel north to the cold, elegant palaces of Copenhagen to meet a young British princess who was sent to marry a king who was losing his mind. Tonight, let's talk about Caroline Matilda of Great Britain and her husband, King Kinthric VII of Denmark. Caroline Matilda was the youngest sister of King George III of England. She was bright, warm, loved to laugh, and had been raised in a quiet, protected country estate away from the drama of the London court. But in 1766, at the age of 15, she was packed up and sent to Denmark to marry her first cousin, King Christian VII of Denmark.
But amidst all this darkness, there was one person who could calm the storm in Eric's mind: Karen Monsdotter. Karen was a commoner, the daughter of a soldier and a peasant woman. She was working as a maid in a tavern, or perhaps selling nuts in the Stockholm market, when she caught the king's eye. She was young, remarkably beautiful, and had a gentle, deeply serene personality. Eric fell in love with her, and in 1565, she became his official mistress. Unlike the noble ladies of the court who treated Eric with fear and cold formality, Karen treated him with warmth and genuine affection. When Eric suffered from severe panic attacks or hallucinations, Karen would sit with him, hold his hand, and talk to him in a quiet, soothing voice. She was the only person in the world he trusted, but the Swedish nobility was horrified. They could tolerate a king having a peasant mistress, but Eric was treating Karen like a queen. He gave her expensive apartments, dressed her in royal silks, and when she gave birth to a daughter, Sigrid, the baby was treated as a legitimate princess. In 1567, Eric's paranoia finally exploded into a physical nightmare known to history as the Stur murders. Eric became convinced that the powerful Stur family, one of the most prominent noble houses in Sweden, was plotting a massive rebellion. He had several leading members of the family arrested and imprisoned in the dungeon of Uppsala Castle. On May 24th, Eric rode to Uppsala to attend the trial, but as he walked into the castle, his mind completely snapped. He walked into the cell of young Count Nils Stur, who was lying on his bed, and stabbed him in the chest with a dagger. The king's guards then rushed in and slaughtered the rest of the imprisoned nobles. Immediately after the killings, Eric was struck by a wave of intense, overwhelming guilt. He ran out of the castle and into the surrounding countryside, completely out of his mind. He wandered the forests for 3 days, dressed as a peasant, screaming that he was not the king, that he had murdered his friends, and that the devil was chasing him. His guards searched the woods for days before they finally found him, disheveled, wild-eyed, and barely conscious. It was Karen Monsdaughter who saved him. When they brought the king back to the capital, he would scream in terror if anyone else came near him. But when Karen walked into the room, he fell to his knees, wept into her lap, and slowly began to calm down. For several months, Eric was too unstable to rule, but when he finally recovered, he made a decision that would seal his fate. He decided that he was going to marry Karen, because why let a little thing like complete noble outrage stand in the way of marrying the woman who saved your sanity? In July of 1568, Eric and Karen were married in a grand public ceremony in Stockholm. Karen was officially crowned as the Queen of Sweden. It was a true rags to riches story, but it was the final straw for the Swedish nobility. Eric's brothers, John and Charles, raised a massive army of disgruntled nobles and marched on Stockholm. The city surrendered, and Eric was deposed. John became King John III, and he was determined to make sure Eric could never reclaim his throne. Eric was imprisoned in a series of cold, dark castles for 9 long years. At first, Karen and their children were allowed to stay with him, but John, who was terrified of a rescue attempt, eventually separated them, sending Karen and the children to Finland. Eric spent his final years alone, writing sad, rambling notes in the margins of his books, playing his lute, and staring out window at the gray Swedish sky. In February of 1577, Eric died suddenly at the age of 43. The official announcement from the court was that he had died from a sudden natural illness, but rumors persisted for centuries that he was murdered on his brother's orders. In 1958, Eric's tomb was opened and his remains were examined by modern scientists. They found that his bones contained lethal levels of arsenic, and the traditional Swedish legend was finally confirmed. The Mad King Eric XIV had been poisoned by his guards, who had slipped the arsenic into his favorite food, a bowl of warm yellow pea soup. Let's float away from the cold, arsenic-laced dungeons of Sweden and head to a warmer but no less dramatic court. We will travel to France during the reign of the legendary Sun King, Louis XIV, to meet his younger brother, who was forced into 2 arranged marriages, but who preferred a very different kind of company. Tonight, let's talk about Philippe I, Duke of Orleans, affectionately known to his family and the French court as Monsieur. Philippe was the younger brother of Louis XIV. He was intelligent, remarkably charming, an incredibly brave soldier on the battlefield, and possessed a natural talent for courtly etiquette and design. But Philippe also had some very distinct, highly public preferences. He loved to dress in women's clothes. He would spend hours in front of his mirrors putting on heavy makeup, applying beauty patches, and wearing elaborate ribbon-trimmed gowns and high-heeled shoes. He loved jewelry, perfumes, and spent a fortune on lace and silk. Louis XIV didn't mind his brother's cross-dressing. In fact, the king actively encouraged it. The French royal family had a long, bloody history of younger brothers launching rebellions against the king. Louis figured if Philippe was busy choosing ribbons and trying on gowns, he wouldn't have the time or inclination to plot a coup. And he was right. Philippe was completely loyal to his brother, but Philippe still had to be married. The French crown needed to secure its alliances, and Philippe needed to produce heirs. His first wife was Henrietta of England, the beautiful, lively sister of King Charles II. Henrietta was 16 years old, and she was expecting a glamorous, romantic French prince. Instead, she got Philippe, who would often show up to their shared events wearing more jewelry and heavier makeup than she was. The marriage was an absolute disaster. Philippe had no physical interest in her wife, preferring the company of a string of handsome male favorites, most notably Philippe de Laurent, the Chevalier de Laurent. The Chevalier was handsome, arrogant, and ruled Philippe's household. He treated Henrietta with complete contempt, and Henrietta, who was a proud English princess, complained to the king. The court was a hotbed of petty drama. Henrietta would try to have the Chevalier exiled, Philippe would throw massive, tearful tantrums, and the king would have to step forward to mediate. Then, in 1670, Henrietta died suddenly at the age of 26 after drinking a glass of chicory water. There were rumors that the Chevalier de Laurent had poisoned her, but modern historians believe she died of peritonitis caused by a ruptured ulcer. Philippe was devastated, not because he loved Henrietta, but because he hated the drama. But the king insisted he marry again, this time to Elizabeth
Charlotte of the Palatine, a German princess known to history as Lieselotte. Lieselotte was the absolute opposite of Henrietta. She was plain, blunt, hated makeup, loved hunting, and spent her time writing thousands of letters detailing the gossip of Versailles. Miraculously, Philippe and Lieselotte actually got along. She accepted Philippe's quirks, and he appreciated her blunt, honest nature. They had 3 children together, after which they mutually agreed to sleep in separate rooms, allowing Philippe to return to his ribbons, his makeup, and his beloved chevalier. So as we drift off to sleep tonight, let's be glad that we don't have to marry our cousins, that our meals aren't laced with arsenic, and that we can wear whatever we want without causing a national crisis.
I hope you are settled in, that the room is quiet, and that you are ready to let your mind drift a little further into the comfortable, dusty corners of the past. Tonight, we are going to continue our journey through the absolute train wrecks of royal domesticity. Go ahead and take a deep, slow breath. Adjust your pillow if you need to, and let's float over to 16th century England, where we will meet a king who was desperate to find a new wife, but who managed to turn his search into one of the most embarrassing blind dates in human history. Let's talk about Henry VIII and his 4th wife, Anne of Cleves. By the year 1539, Henry VIII was no longer the slim, athletic prince of his youth. He was 48 years old, his waistline was rapidly expanding, and he suffered from a massive, foul-smelling ulcer on his leg that made it incredibly difficult for him to walk, let alone be the charming romantic he fancied himself to be. He had already gone through 3 wives. Catherine of Aragon had been cast aside, Anne Boleyn had been beheaded, and his favorite wife, Jane Seymour, had died of childbed fever after giving birth to his only surviving son, Edward. Henry had been a grieving widower for 2 years, but his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, was getting nervous. England was politically isolated, and Cromwell was desperate to secure an alliance with the Protestant princes of northern Germany. Cromwell looked around and found the perfect candidate, Princess Anne of Cleves. Anne was 24 years old, and she lived in a strict, quiet court in Germany. She had been raised to be a proper, modest housewife. She knew how to sew, how to manage a household, and how to read and write in her native German. But she had never been taught to dance, sing, or play an instrument, because in her conservative family, those things were viewed as vanity. She also spoke no English and had never been exposed to the glittering, highly intellectual court life of Tudor London. Henry, who was still a romantic at heart, wanted to know what his future bride looked like before he agreed to the match. So he sent his famous court painter, Hans Holbein the Younger, to Germany to paint her portrait. Holbein was an incredible artist, but he was also acutely aware of who was paying his salary. He painted a beautiful, serene portrait of Anne, showing her with pale, flawless skin, delicate features, and a highly elegant, dignified expression. Henry looked at the painting and was immediately enchanted. He declared that she was a true beauty, signed the treaty, and waited impatiently for her to arrive in England. But as we have already learned, 16th century portraits were the Tinder profiles of the Tudor world. They were heavily filtered, highly flattering, and occasionally completely misleading. In late December of 1539, Anne arrived in England after a long, cold journey. She was staying at Rochester Castle, waiting for her formal public entry into London. Henry, who was filled with childish excitement, decided that he couldn't wait any longer. He wanted to play out a classic romantic chivalric fantasy. He decided to disguise himself as a commoner, sneak into her room, and surprise her. According to the courtly romances Henry loved so much, true love would allow Anne to instantly recognize her handsome royal husband despite his disguise. It was, honestly, a terrible plan. On New Year's Day, 1540, Henry and a few of his friends, all dressed in plain cloaks, burst into Anne's chambers. Anne was standing by the window, watching a bull baiting in the courtyard below, which was probably the most exciting thing she had seen all week. Suddenly, this very large, middle-aged, limping man she had never seen before rushed up to her, grabbed her, and tried to kiss her. Anne was absolutely horrified. She had no idea who this man was. To her, he was just a random, smelly stranger who had violated her privacy. She pushed him away, gave him a cold, disgusted look, and turned back to the window, ignoring him completely. Henry's fragile royal ego was instantly shattered. He went into a side room, took off his disguise, and came back in as the king. Anne, realizing her mistake, fell to her knees and apologized, but the damage was done. Henry was humiliated that his romantic fantasy had failed, and he blamed Anne entirely. He went back to London in a terrible mood, stormed into Thomas Cromwell's office and shouted, "I like her not. She is nothing so fair as she hath been reported." He complained bitterly that she was ugly, that she had loose skin, and that she possessed disagreeable body odors. He famously referred to her, in his frustration, as a Flanders mare. This was almost certainly a massive lie to save his own pride, but Henry was determined to get out of the marriage. But his lawyers told him it was impossible. The treaty had been signed, the alliance was too important, and Germany was watching. Henry had no choice. He had to go through with it. The marriage ceremony took place on January 6th, 1540. Henry looked like he was attending a funeral rather than his own wedding. The wedding night was an absolute disaster of awkwardness. Henry, who was hoping that some physical intimacy would save the situation, found himself completely unable to perform. He blamed Anne's appearance, claiming that her body was so unpleasant that it destroyed his desire. The next morning, Henry walked out of the bedroom and told Cromwell with a sigh, "I liked her before not well, but I like her now much worse. I have left her as good a maid as I found her." For 6 long months, the king and queen lived in this incredibly awkward state. They would share a bed, but Henry would merely kiss her forehead, say goodnight, and turn his back. Anne, who was incredibly naive about how reproduction actually worked, didn't realize anything was wrong. She actually told her ladies-in-waiting that the king was a wonderful, attentive husband. She explained that he would come to her bed, take her hand, kiss her, and say, "Farewell, darling." Her ladies, who knew exactly what was supposed to be happening, had to gently explain to her that a kiss on the hand was not going to produce an heir to the throne. By the summer, Henry had found a new, much younger distraction, a 19-year-old court lady named Catherine Howard. He was now absolutely desperate to get rid of Anne. He suggested to Anne that they annul the marriage on the grounds that it had never been consummated and that she had a pre-contract with another German prince anyway. Anne, showing a remarkable amount of intelligence and survival instinct, didn't fight him. She had watched what had happened to Anne Boleyn, and she had no desire to lose her head over a marriage that neither of them wanted anyway. She readily agreed to the annulment. Henry was so relieved and so grateful for her cooperative attitude that he treated her incredibly well. He declared her his beloved sister, gave her a massive annual pension, and presented her with several beautiful estates, including Hever Castle, which had ironically belonged to the family of Anne Boleyn.
Anne spent the rest of her life in England as a wealthy, independent single woman. She became a close friend of the royal family, visited the court often, drank beer, gambled on cards, and outlived Henry and all of his other wives. She had survived the king's ego, got some beautiful real estate out of the deal, and ended up with one of the most comfortable retirements in royal history. Let's float over to another royal who had a very unique, highly unsettling way of handling grief and maternal affection. We will travel across the North Sea to Sweden to meet a queen whose obsession with her husband was so intense it survived long after he did. Tonight, let's talk about Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg and her husband Gustavus Adolphus. Maria Eleonora was a German princess who, in 1620, married the legendary king of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus, widely regarded as one of the greatest military commanders of his age. Gustavus was tall, brave, and deeply admired by his people. Maria Eleonora was beautiful, but she was also emotionally fragile, highly dramatic, and completely obsessed with her husband. She loved him with a frantic, suffocating intensity. Whenever Gustavus went away to lead his armies in the 30 Years' War, Maria Eleonora would fall into deep depressions, weeping for days, refusing to eat, and writing him frantic letters begging him to return. But her real obsession with him began after his death. In 1632, Gustavus Adolphus was killed at the Battle of Lutzen. When the news reached Maria Eleonora, her fragile mind completely snapped. She refused to let her husband go. She had his body brought back to Sweden, but she refused to allow him to be buried. For over a year and a half, she kept his embalmed corpse in a room in the castle of Nykoping. She hung heavy black velvet curtains over the windows to block out the light, and spent her days sitting by the open coffin, talking to him, stroking his hair, and weeping over his decomposing body. But her grief took a truly Gothic turn when she decided to keep a piece of him with her at all times. She had the king's heart placed in a small gold casket, which she hung directly over her bed. Every night she would sleep beneath her husband's embalmed heart, and she would occasionally take it down to kiss it and cradle it in her arms. The Swedish nobility was understandably completely horrified. The country was being run by a regency council, and they were were desperate to bury the king so the nation could move on. But every time they tried to take the body away, Maria Eleonora would throw massive, violent tantrums, threatening to kill herself if they touched him. Finally, in 1634, the council had to launch a secret, late-night operation. They snuck into her apartments while she was sleeping, snatched the casket containing the heart, and finally buried Gustavus Adolphus in the royal vault. Deprived of her husband's body, Maria Eleonora turned her intense, unstable attention to her daughter, the 6-year-old Queen Christina. Christina was now the ruler of Sweden, but her childhood was a living nightmare. Maria Eleonora had wanted a boy, and she openly despised her daughter for being a girl. When Christina was born, she had looked at her and screamed, "Instead of a son, I am given a daughter, dark and ugly with a great nose and cold eyes. Take her from me. I will not have such a monster." Throughout Christina's childhood, Maria Eleonora made several accidents happen. She would accidentally drop the baby onto the floor or allow heavy beams to fall near her cradle. One of these falls actually left one of Christina's shoulders permanently deformed, leaving her with one shoulder higher than the other for the rest of her life. She also forced the young queen to live in her mother's dark mourning apartments. The rooms were draped in black velvet, lit only by sputtering candles, and smelled of stale incense and old wax. Christina had to sleep in her mother's bed, with her mother weeping over her every night, telling her how ugly and useless she was. Eventually, the Swedish government had to step in again. They realized that the Queen of Sweden was being raised by a woman who was actively trying to destroy her physical and mental health. They stripped Maria Eleonora of her maternal rights, banned her from the court, and placed Christina under the care of her father's sister. Christina went on to become one of the most brilliant, eccentric, and nonconformist queens in history, famous for refusing to marry, dressing in men's clothes, and eventually abdicating her throne to convert to Catholicism and move to Rome. But her childhood under the shadow of her mother's Gothic grief left scars that would never fully heal. Let's float over to another cold German court, where a future king of Great Britain managed to turn his domestic life into a dark, scandalous melodrama that would end in a lifetime of solitary confinement. Tonight, let's talk about King George I of Great Britain, back when he was just George Louis, Elector of Hanover, and his unfortunate wife, Sophia Dorothea of Celle. In 1682, George Louis was a cold, arrogant, and deeply unpleasant German prince. He had no charm, no manners, and a severe underbite that made him look permanently grumpy. But his family wanted to unite the territory of Hanover with the wealthy Duchy of Celle, so they arranged a marriage between George and his first cousin, Sophia Dorothea. Sophia Dorothea was 16 years old, and she was the absolute opposite of George. She was beautiful, warm, witty, and had a passion for music and fashion. When she was told she had to marry George, she fainted. She wrote to her mother that she would rather die than marry that cold, rude boy. But as we know in the world of royal marriages, your feelings were completely irrelevant. The wedding took place and the couple moved into the palace in Hanover. The marriage was a disaster from day one. George treated his wife with complete indifference. He spent his time with his two mistresses, Erengard Melusine von der Schulenburg, who was so tall and thin that the public called her the Maypole, and Sophia Charlotte von Platen, who was so large and round that they called her the Elephant. George didn't particularly care if his wife was lonely, as long as she produced heirs. Sophia Dorothea did her duty, giving birth to a son, the future George II, and a daughter, but she was miserable, isolated, and constantly bullied by George's mother and his mistresses. Then, in 1690, a handsome Swedish count arrived at the court of Hanover, Philip Christoph von Königsmarck. Königsmarck was a classic romantic hero. He was tall, dashing, athletic, and had his youth traveling across Europe, getting into duels and charming women. He had actually known Sophia Dorothea when they were children, and when they met again in Hanover, they fell deeply, passionately in love. They began a secret, highly dangerous affair. Because they couldn't see each other often, they wrote hundreds of passionate, secret letters. These letters, which still survive today, are filled with dramatic declarations of love, plans to run away together, and some very unflattering descriptions of George and his mistresses. It was a beautiful, romantic escape, but they were incredibly reckless. They used secret codes that were easily cracked, and they trusted servants who were actually spies for George's family. The situation came to a head in July of 1994. Königsmarck went to Sophia Dorothea
Dorothea's apartments late one night to help her pack her bags so they could finally escape to France. He was never seen again. According to the most reliable court rumors, George's family had found out about the escape plan. As Königsmarck was leaving the palace, he was ambushed by 4 guards, beaten to death, and his body was either thrown into the Liner River or buried beneath the floorboards of the palace. George was absolutely furious, not because his heart was broken, but because his family's honor had been compromised. He wanted to make sure Sophia Dorothea was punished for her betrayal. He divorced her, stripped her of her title, and took her children away. But he didn't stop there. He had Sophia Dorothea arrested and imprisoned in the castle of Nykoping, a cold, drafty fortress surrounded by a moat in the middle of a swamp. She was only 28 years old. She was forbidden to ever see her children again, forbidden from remarriage, and forbidden from leaving the castle grounds without a guard. She was allowed to walk in a small, fenced garden, but the rest of her life was spent staring out the window at the gray, misty marshland. George went on to become King George I of Great Britain in 1714. He took his mistresses with him to London, where the British public found him cold, boring, and highly suspicious. They knew about the captive princess back in Germany, and they hated him for it.
Sophia Dorothea spent 32 years in that damp castle, slowly losing her mind to loneliness and grief. She died in 1726 at the age of 60. On her deathbed, she wrote a final bitter letter to George, cursing him from beyond the grave for what he had done to her life. Just 4 weeks after her death, George was traveling to Germany when he suffered a sudden, fatal stroke in his carriage. The superstitious public believed that Sophia Dorothea's curse had finally caught up with him. Let's float over to our final stop tonight, a fairy tale kingdom that existed mostly in the mind of a very tall, very lonely Bavarian king who was completely detached from the reality of his own century. Tonight, let's look at the tragic, beautiful life of King Ludwig II of Bavaria, famously known to history as the fairy tale king or Mad King Ludwig. Ludwig became the king of Bavaria in 1864. At the age of 18, he was remarkably handsome, tall with dark curly hair, intense blue eyes, and a highly dramatic, romantic bearing. He looked like a prince from a Disney movie, which was appropriate because he wanted his entire life to be a fairy tale. But Ludwig had a major problem. He hated the 19th century. He hated politics, he hated the modern industrial world, and most of all, he hated the fact that he was supposed to marry a princess and produce heirs. Ludwig was gay at a time when homosexuality was not only socially impossible for a king, but actively illegal. He fought a constant, agonizing battle with his own deep religious faith and his natural desires, writing frantic, guilt-ridden notes in his diary, promising himself that he would never sin again, only to fall in love with his handsome stablemaster, Richard Hornig, or a succession of young actors and soldiers. Because of his duty to the state, his family pressured him to marry. In January of 1867, he reluctantly announced his engagement to his cousin, Duchess Sophie Charlotte in Bavaria, the younger sister of his close friend, Empress Elizabeth of Austria. Sophie was sweet, loved music, and was quite fond of Ludwig, but Ludwig was absolutely terrified of the marriage. He repeatedly postponed the wedding date. He would spend his days writing passionate letters to Sophie, calling her his Elsa and himself her Lohengrin, referencing the opera characters of his favorite composer, Richard Wagner. But whenever the actual wedding day drew near, Ludwig would panic, find an excuse to postpone it, and flee to his mountain retreat. He spent a fortune on the wedding preparations, including a custom-made gilded royal carriage that looked like it belonged to Cinderella, but he just couldn't bring himself to go through with it. Finally, in October of 1867, after postponing the wedding for the 4th time, Ludwig officially called off the engagement. He wrote a relieved letter to his diary, thanking God that he was finally free of the terrible nightmare of marriage. With the threat of domestic life officially gone, Ludwig decided to withdraw completely from the real world. He began building a series of massive, highly theatrical, and incredibly expensive castles in the Bavarian Alps. The most famous of these was Neuschwanstein Castle, a glittering white fairy tale fortress that sat on a rocky crag designed to look like a medieval knight's castle. Ludwig didn't build these castles to show off his power. In fact, he didn't want anyone else to ever set foot in them. He built them as
private stages where he could live out his historical fantasies. He became nocturnal, sleeping during the day and staying awake all night. He would spend his nights dressed in elaborate historical costumes, riding through the dark mountain forests in his gilded sleigh-shaped carriage lit by electric lanterns, while his servants stood by the road dressed as 18th century footmen. He would also hire entire theaters for private performances. He would sit alone in the dark royal box, watching operas by Richard Wagner or plays about Louis XIV, while the actors performed for an audience of one. To fund his massive castle-building projects, Ludwig ran up enormous debts, borrowing millions from foreign banks and even his own family. When his ministers refused to give him more money, he threatened to kidnap them or commit suicide. By 1886, the Bavarian government had had enough. They realized that the king was bankrupting the country and completely unfit to rule. They decided to depose him on the grounds of insanity. They hired a prominent psychiatrist, Dr. Bernard von Gudden, to write a medical report declaring Ludwig insane. The catch was that Dr. Gudden had never actually examined Ludwig. He simply gathered gossip from the king's disgruntled servants, who complained that Ludwig was rude, made them dress up in historical costumes, and had conversations with imaginary people. On June 12, 1886, a government commission arrived at Neuschwanstein Castle, arrested Ludwig, and took him to Berg Castle on the shores of Lake Starnberg, where he was placed under medical supervision. The next evening, on June 13th, Ludwig and Dr. Gudden went for a walk along the shore of the lake. They were supposed to return by 8, but they never did. A search party was launched, and at 11 that night, the bodies of both the king and the doctor were found floating in the shallow water of the lake. Ludwig's watch had stopped at 6:54. The official government report declared that Ludwig had committed suicide by drowning and that Dr. Gudden had died trying to save him, but the mystery remains unsolved to this day. Ludwig's lungs contained no water, suggesting he had not drowned. Some historians believe he was shot while attempting to escape, while others believe he suffered a heart attack in the freezing water. With his death, the tragic, beautiful dream of the fairy tale king came to an end, but his castles remained, eventually becoming some of the most famous tourist attractions in the world, proving that sometimes a king's mad dreams can outlast the cold reality of his ministers. So, as we drift off to sleep tonight, let's be glad that we don't have to marry a king who thinks he's a medieval knight, that we don't have to sleep under our husband's heart, and that we can just close our eyes and let the world fade away. Sweet dreams.
My friends, go ahead and take a moment to find your most comfortable position. Pull the blankets up, settle your head into the pillow, and let the gentle rhythm of my voice carry you back into the strange, quiet, and deeply dysfunctional world of our ancestors. Tonight, we are going to explore some of the most extraordinary, bizarre, and downright awkward moments in the private lives of royal history. If you thought the figures we have met so far were eccentric, the ones waiting for us tonight take things to a whole new level: fragility, malice, and complete domestic mismatch. So let's close our eyes, take a deep, slow breath, and let the modern world fade away. Let's float over to late 14th century France, where we will meet a king who started out with the best of intentions, but whose mind became so delicate he believed a single touch would break into 1,000 pieces. Let's talk about King Charles VI of France, famously known to history in his youth as Charles the Beloved, but eventually, far more accurately, as Charles the Mad. Charles became king in 1380 when he was just 11 years old. For the first 8 years of his reign, France was run by his greedy, bickering uncles, who spent their time emptying the royal treasury, raising taxes to fund their own private wars. But when Charles turned 20, he politely but firmly told his uncles to go home, took control of the government, and hired a team of highly capable, honest advisors. He lowered taxes, restored order, and became so popular with the ordinary people of France that they affectionately called him the Beloved. He was young, athletic, loved tournaments, and was married to a beautiful German princess named Isabeau of Bavaria. It seemed like France was finally in good hands, but in the summer of 1392, everything changed. Charles was leading a military expedition through the dense forest forest of Le Mans on a mission to capture a noble who had tried to assassinate his chief advisor. It was an incredibly hot, humid August day. The king was riding in full armor, sweating profusely, already suffering from a fever. Suddenly, a wild-eyed man dressed in rags rushed out of the trees, grabbed the bridle of the king's horse, and screamed, "Ride no further, noble king! Turn back! You are betrayed!" The king's guards quickly dragged the man away, but the king was visibly shaken. He kept riding in silence, his paranoia mounting by the minute in the stiff heat. A few minutes later, one of the king's pages, who grown sleepy in the heat, accidentally dropped his heavy metal lance. It fell with a loud, clattering crash directly onto the helmet of another knight riding nearby. To the feverish, paranoid Charles, that metallic crash was the sound of an ambush. He drew his sword, spurred his horse, and charged his own vanguard, screaming, "Forward against the traitors! They wish to deliver me to the enemy." Before his shocked knights could realize what was happening, Charles had killed 4 of his own men. Nobody wanted to draw a weapon against the king, so they simply ran from it, trying to dodge his wild swings. Finally, after his horse became exhausted, his chamberlain managed to sneak up behind him, grab him, and disarm him. Charles fell into a deep coma that lasted days. When he finally woke up, he was normal again. He apologized profusely to the families of the men he had killed, paid them pensions, and tried to return to his royal duties. But the madness had taken root. For the next 30 years, Charles suffered from at least 40 distinct, prolonged psychotic episodes, each lasting for weeks or months. During these periods, he was completely unable to rule, and his behavior became increasingly bizarre and distressing. During some episodes, Charles forgot his own name, forgot that he was the King of France, and refused to believe that he had a wife and children. When his wife, Isabeau, tried to visit him in his chambers, he would look at her with complete blankness, push her away, and ask his servants who this strange woman was and why she was bothering him. He even scraped his own royal coat of arms off his gold and silver plates, claiming they belonged to someone else. But Charles's most famous and most tragic delusion was his absolute conviction that his body was entirely glass. He was terrified that if he moved too quick, sat down too hard, or came into contact with another person, he would shatter into flying shards. To protect himself, Charles had special, custom-made clothing designed. He had his tailors sew thick, heavy iron rods into his royal robes and undergarments, creating a sort of internal cage that he hoped would keep his fragile glass body intact if he bumped into a wall. He refused to let anyone touch him, including his advisors, his doctors, and his servants. He would wrap himself dozens of thick, heavy blankets, spend his days sitting completely motionless in a dark corner of his rooms, and panic anyone came within 6 feet of him. To make matters worse, during his long periods of madness, his hygiene completely deteriorated. He refused to bathe, change his clothes, or let his servants wash his bed sheets for months at a time. He became so covered in dirt and lice that his skin began to rot. Eventually, a group of 10 of his servants had to put on masks, sneak into his room in the middle of the night, strip him by force, wash him, dress him in clean clothes, all while the terrified king screamed that they were breaking his glass bones. Amid this tragedy, Charles's wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, found herself in an impossible position. She had to run a highly corrupt, bickering court while her husband was locked away in his rooms. She eventually formed a political alliance with Charles's ambitious brother, Louis of Orleans, which sparked rumors of an affair, further destabilized the kingdom. But the most dramatic and almost fatal moment of Charles's reign occurred in January of 1393, during an event that became known to history as the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of Burning Men. Isabeau was hosting a grand masquerade ball at the palace in Paris to celebrate the wedding of one of her ladies-in-waiting. To entertain the guests, Charles and 5 of his closest noble friends decided to perform a wild theatrical dance. They dressed up as wild men of the forest. Their costumes were made of tight linen suits that had been coated in highly flammable pitch and covered in dry yellow flax to look like shaggy hair. Because the costumes were so flammable, the king's guards had strictly banned any torches or candles from entering the great hall where the dance was taking place. But late in the evening, the king's brother, Louis of Orleans, arrived at the party. He was drunk, loud, and didn't care about the safety rules. He entered the hall carrying a burning torch so he could see who was behind the masks. Louis approached the group of wild men who were dancing, howling in the center of the room. He held his torch close to one of their faces to try and identify him. A stray spark fell from the torch onto the dry flax of the costume. In seconds, the costume erupted erupted in flames. The fire spread instantly from one dancer to another, turning the center of the ballroom into a roaring, screaming inferno of burning pitch. The guests panicked, screaming and running for the exits, while the 5 burning nobles shrieked in agony. The king was also but he had temporarily stepped away from the other dancers to talk to his young aunt, the 15-year-old Duchess of Berry. When the fire broke out, the quick-thinking Duchess immediately realized what was happening. She grabbed her massive, heavy velvet overskirt, threw it completely over the king to smother any sparks, and held him tight until the danger had passed. Charles was saved, but the other 5 dancers were not so lucky. One of them managed to save himself by jumping into a large tub of dishwater in the palace kitchen, but 4 of the king's closest friends suffered agonizing burns and died over the next few days. The disaster of the burning men shattered whatever fragile stability remained in Charles's mind. He fell back into deep madness, and France slid into a brutal civil war between rival noble factions, which allowed Henry V of England to invade and conquer much of the country. Charles VI died in 2022, a broken, lonely glass king who had spent his life trying not to shatter, while his kingdom fell to pieces around him. Let's float away from the burning, smoky ball of medieval France and head north to the cold, punctilious court of late 19th century Prussia, where we will meet a princess who was forced into a quiet marriage, but who managed to turn her frustration into one of the most toxic, scandalous blackmail schemes in royal history. Tonight, let's talk about Princess Charlotte, Prussia, and the infamous Katze affair, also known as the Grunenwald scandal. Charlotte, born in 1860, was the eldest daughter of Victoria, the Princess Royal, and the granddaughter of Queen Victoria of Great Britain. Her younger brother would go on to become the infamous Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. Charlotte was not a quiet, sweet Victorian princess. She was bright, high-spirited, incredibly vain, and possessed a sharp, malicious wit. She had a toxic, deeply dysfunctional relationship with her mother,
Who tried to raise her with strict British morality. Charlotte rebelled against every rule, skipped her lessons, and spent her time gossiping and causing trouble. By the time she was 16, her parents were so desperate to get her out of the house that they agreed to let her marry her second cousin, Prince Bernhard of Saxe-Meiningen. Bernhard was a mild-mannered, quiet, and deeply intellectual man. He loved books, archaeology, and music, and had no interest in the fast-paced, gossipy court life of Berlin. Charlotte, on the other hand, lived for it. She neglected her husband, ignored her only daughter, and spent her time throwing wild parties, smoking cigarettes in public, and collecting every scrap of dirty laundry she could find on the Prussian aristocracy. But Charlotte's real masterpiece of malice began in January of 1891 at a royal hunting lodge called Jagdschloss Grunewald, just outside Berlin. Charlotte and her brother-in-law, Duke Ernst Gunther of Schleswig-Holstein, hosted a private weekend hunting party for 15 of the highest-ranking nobles and court officials in Germany. The Prussian court publicly presented an image of strict, conservative, and punctilious morality. But behind the heavy closed doors of the Grunewald hunting lodge, the party quickly deteriorated into what modern historians describe as a wild, swingers-style sex session. The champagne flowed, the music played, and the elite of Berlin's high society engaged in activities that would have caused a mass outbreak of fainting back at the palace. The next day, the partygoers returned to Berlin hungover and determined to pretend that nothing had happened. But they had made a fatal mistake. They had allowed Charlotte to watch them. A few days later, several of the participants received letters in the mail. These were not ordinary letters. They were anonymous, highly detailed blackmail letters that described in graphic locker room language exactly what had happened at the hunting lodge the night before. To make things worse, the author had included pornographic illustrations and collages, pasting the heads of the royal court members onto drawings of naked bodies in various compromising positions. Over the next 4 years, more than 200 of these poison pen letters were sent to the highest-ranking members of German high society, including the Kaiser himself. The letters exposed the secret affairs, the hidden homosexual relationships, and the bizarre sexual preferences of the entire
entire imperial family and their advisors. The court was plunged into a state of absolute paranoid terror. Nobody knew who the author was, and everyone started looking at their friends and spouses with deep suspicion. The Kaiser ordered a secret police investigation to find the culprit. Because the letters contained details that only a highly placed insider could possibly know, the police concluded that the author had to be someone who was present at the Grunewald party. Eventually, their suspicion fell on Leibebert von Kotze, the Kaiser's highly popular master of ceremonies. Kotze was known for his sharp, sarcastic wit, and he was unpopular with some members of the court because of his love of gossip and his bright, slightly eccentric clothing. The police searched his rooms, found some paper that looked similar to the blackmail letters, and arrested him. Kotze spent several weeks in prison, his reputation completely ruined. But even while he was locked away, the letters kept arriving. It was clear they had arrested the wrong man. Kotze was eventually released and acquitted of all charges. But in the strict, militaristic world of Prussian honor, an acquittal was not enough. Kotze had to clear his name through the traditional bloody method, duels. He challenged two of his chief accusers to pistols at 10 paces. In the first duel, Kotze was wounded but survived. In the second duel, which took place in 1896, Kotze shot and killed Karl von Schroeder, one of the court's most prominent barons. The scandal had turned from a dirty joke into a tragedy. So who was the real author of the poison pen letters? The Prussian police eventually confiscated a blotting paper from Charlotte's desk that contained traces of the distinct ink used in the letters. Modern historians who examined the secret archives have concluded that Charlotte herself was almost certainly the mastermind behind the entire scandal. She had used her position at the center of Berlin's society to gather dirt on everyone, and had written the letters simply for her own sick amusement and to destroy the reputations of her rivals. She watched her friends ruin their lives, go to prison, and shoot each other in cold-blooded duels, all while sitting in her parlor, smoking her cigarettes, and enjoying the show. Let's float over to our final stop tonight, a warm, sunny kingdom that was run by a young queen who had some of the most legendary amorous appetites in history, but whose arranged marriage was a complete comical disaster. We will travel to Spain in the mid-19th century to meet Queen Isabella II. Isabella became the Queen of Spain in 1833 when she was just 3 years old. Her childhood was a chaotic mess of civil wars, palace conspiracies, and military coups, and her education was almost completely neglected. She was essentially illiterate, grew up without any parental discipline, and was left to run wild in the vast, drafty chambers of the royal palace of Madrid. But when she turned 16, the European powers decided she needed to be married. This was not a simple decision. Every major empire in Europe wanted to put their own prince on the Spanish throne. After months of intense, incredibly boring diplomatic bickering, the French and British agreed to a compromise candidate who would not upset the balance of power. They chose Isabella's double first cousin, Infante Francisco de Assis, the Duke of Cadiz. Francisco and Isabella shared the exact same set of grandparents. Their fathers were brothers and their mothers were sisters. But the physical closeness of their family tree was the least of their problems. Francisco was shy, incredibly effeminate, and had no interest in women. He spoke in a high-pitched, squeaky voice, was obsessed with lace and perfumes, and was widely known in Madrid society to be gay. To make things worse, Francisco suffered from a physical malformation called hypospadias, which meant his urethra opened on the underside of his penis rather than the tip. This condition made it impossible for him to urinate while standing up, which led to a highly popular, highly embarrassing rumor in Madrid's society that the king consort had to sit down like a lady to use the chamber pot. Isabella was a healthy, passionate, and incredibly energetic young woman who was deeply curious about romance. When she was told she had to marry Francisco, she cried out in despair, "No, not Paquita, anything but Paquita," using the feminine nickname the Spanish public had given him. But her mother and her ministers didn't care. On October 10th, 1846, Isabella's 16th birthday, the double wedding took place. The wedding night was an absolute comedy of errors. The next morning, Isabella walked out of the bridal chamber, her face a mask of complete, utter disgust. She cornered her chief lady of waiting and complained bitterly about her new husband's complete lack of masculine qualities. "What can I say about a man who on our wedding night had more lace on his nightshirt than I did on my gown, and who spent the entire night looking at his own trousers?" Isabella remarked. Isabella had absolutely no intention intention of spending her life waiting for Francisco to show an interest in her. She immediately expelled him from her bedroom, banned him from her apartments, and began a series of highly public, highly passionate affairs with some of the most dashing men in Spain. Her first target was General Francisco Serrano, a handsome military hero who was 20 years her senior. She moved him directly into her private apartments, and when her ministers tried to remonstrate with her, she simply ignored them. Serrano was just the first in a long, endless parade of lovers. Isabella slept with singers, actors, army captains, and young diplomats. Her sexual appetites became the talk of Europe, and she didn't particularly care who knew. But Spain still needed heirs, and over the next 20 years, Isabella gave birth to 12 children. Naturally, everyone in Spain knew that Francisco was not the father of any of them. The paternity of her children was a public joke. When her son, the future King Alfonso XII, was born in 1857,
The public openly referred to him as the Puy Moltejo because everyone knew his biological father was a handsome young captain of engineers named Enrique Puig Moltol. But Francisco was not stupid. He knew he had a great thing going. He was the king consort of Spain, lived in a beautiful palace, and had his debts paid by the treasury. So he made a deal with his wife. Every time Isabella got pregnant by one of her lovers, Francisco would demand a massive bribe, usually millions of reals, from the government treasury to publicly stand next to the queen at the baptism, hold the baby, and claim it as his own legitimate child. It was a highly lucrative, highly bureaucratic business model. The Spanish people eventually grew tired of the constant scandals, the corrupt bribes, and the queen's complete disregard for her duties. In 1868, a military revolution deposed Isabella, and she and Francisco were forced to flee to Paris, where they spent the rest of their lives living in separate apartments, barely speaking to each other. So, as we drift off to sleep tonight, let's be glad that we are warm in our beds, with no iron rods sewn in our pajamas, no anonymous blackmail letters waiting in our mailboxes, and no double cousin marriages to negotiate. Sweet dreams. I hope you are feeling deeply relaxed, that your room is dark and quiet, and that you are ready to let your mind drift a little further into the comfortable, dusty corners of royal history. Tonight, we are going to explore some of the most extraordinary, bizarre, and downright awkward moments in the private lives of the European elite. If you thought the figures we have met so far were eccentric, the ones waiting for us tonight take things to a whole new level of instability, child's play, and complete domestic mismatch. So, let's close our eyes, take a deep, slow breath, and let the modern world fade away. Let's float over to 17th century Portugal, where we will meet a king who was supposed to be the glorious ruler of a newly independent nation, but who preferred the company of street brawlers, unwashed clothes, and a complete lack of royal decorum. Let's talk about King Alfonso VI of Portugal, famously known to his court and to history as the Victorious, though as we will see, he had absolutely nothing to do with any of his victories. Alfonso was born in 1643, during a time of intense political turmoil. Portugal had just broken away from Spanish rule, and the royal family was desperate to establish their legitimacy. But when Alfonso was just 3 years old, he suffered a devastating illness, likely meningoencephalitis, which left him partially paralyzed on the right side of his body and mentally unstable. He was slow to learn, had severe learning difficulties, and was prone to sudden, violent outbursts of rage. His mother, the formidable Queen Luisa, tried her best to educate him, but Alfonso had absolutely no interest in books, statecraft, or courtly etiquette. As he grew into a teenager, he decided that his favorite place in the world was not the elegant royal palace, but the dirty, dangerous docks of Lisbon. Alfonso spent his youth running with a gang of low-born street ruffians, sailors, and dock workers. He would dress in rags, slip out of the palace in the middle of the night, and spend his hours drinking in the seediest taverns, getting into street brawls, and throwing rocks at random citizens. He became particularly
close to a young merchant's son named Antonio de Sousa de Macedo, who became the leader of the king's street gang and, eventually, the de facto ruler of the country. The Portuguese nobility was, understandably, completely horrified. They had spent decades fighting to free themselves from Spain, only to end up with a king who preferred throwing mud at peasants to running the government. But things got even worse when Alfonso reached the age of 22. His ministers, desperate to find a way to make him behave like a proper monarch, decided that he needed to be married. They hoped a refined, intelligent European princess would tame his wild habits and produce an heir to the throne. They looked around and settled on Mary Françoise of Nemours, a beautiful, highly educated French princess who was the cousin of King Louis XIV. Mary Françoise was expecting a glamorous, romantic southern prince, but instead, when she arrived in Lisbon in 1666, she got Alfonso. The first meeting was a complete disaster. Alfonso showed up to greet his new bride wearing multiple layers of dirty, unwashed clothes, which he famously refused to change for weeks at a time because he believed clean linen was a conspiracy to make him cold. He had a severe limp, drooled occasionally, and smelled of the Lisbon docks. He didn't even look at Mary Françoise. Instead, he immediately began boasting to her French entourage about how many street brawls he had won and how many rocks he could throw. It was a match made in a very damp, very smelly hell. Mary Françoise tried her best to be a queen, but the king's behavior in the bedroom was even more disastrous than his public appearances. He was completely impotent and had absolutely no interest in her wife. Instead of spending his nights in the bridal chamber, he would bring his street gang into the palace, where they would drink beer, eat greasy sausages in bed, and shoot pistols at the tapestries. Mary Françoise spent her nights crying in a corner of her room, listening to the sounds of the king and his friends shouting, breaking furniture down the hall. Eventually, Mary Françoise decided she had enough of the victorious king. She was young, ambitious, and she realized that there was a much better option available: Alfonso's younger brother, Pedro. Pedro was everything Alfonso was not. He was handsome, athletic, intelligent, and highly respected by the nobility. Mary Françoise and Pedro began a secret political alliance, which quickly turned into a passionate, secret love affair. Together, they plotted to overthrow the king. In November of 1667, Mary Françoise went to a local convent and declared that her marriage to Alfonso was invalid because it had never been consummated due to the king's physical and mental disabilities. At the same time, Pedro and his allies among the nobility launched a bloodless coup. They entered the palace, arrested Alfonso's favorite street gang advisor, Antonio, and forced Alfonso to sign a document abdicating his power and naming Pedro as regent. Alfonso was completely helpless. His street gang was gone, and he had no support among the nobility. He was stripped of his crown, and Mary Françoise was granted an annulment from her marriage to Alfonso. Just a few months later, she married Alfonso's brother, Pedro, becoming the Queen of Portugal for a second time, with a much more suitable husband. And what of the deposed King Alfonso? He was treated as a political prisoner for the rest of his life. Pedro and Mary Françoise locked him away in the remote palace of Angra in the Azores Islands, where he spent several years staring at the ocean and talking to his guards. Later, he was moved back to the Palace of Sintra, just outside Lisbon. He was kept in a single, comfortable room, but he was never allowed to leave. He spent his days pacing the floor, wearing out the stone tiles, and listening to the wind through the trees. He died in 1683, at the age of 40, after suffering a stroke. His brother Pedro and his former wife Mary Françoise ruled Portugal in peace, proving that sometimes the best way to handle a dysfunctional husband is simply to lock him in a room and marry his brother. Let's float over to another cold, vast empire, where a mother and her son waged a quiet psychological war that ended with a pug-faced emperor running a country like a military school, and a marriage that was ruined by a secret chest of love letters. Tonight, let's talk about Tsar Paul I of Russia. Paul was born in 1754, and his childhood was dominated by one of the most powerful, ruthless women in history, his mother, Catherine the Great. Catherine had overthrown.
The public openly referred to him as the Puy Moltejo because everyone knew his biological father was a handsome young captain of engineers named Enrique Puigmoltol. But Francisco was not stupid. He knew he had a great thing going. He was the king consort of Spain, lived in a beautiful palace, and had his debts paid by the treasury. So he made a deal with his wife. Every time Isabella got pregnant by one of her lovers, Francisco would demand a massive bribe, usually millions of reals, from the government treasury to publicly stand next to the queen at the baptism, hold the baby, and claim it as his own legitimate child. It was a highly lucrative, highly bureaucratic business model. The Spanish people eventually grew tired of the constant scandals, the corrupt bribes, and the queen's complete disregard for her duties. In 1868, a military revolution deposed Isabella, and she and Francisco were forced to flee to Paris, where they spent the rest of their lives living in separate apartments, barely speaking to each other. So, as we drift off to sleep tonight, let's be glad that we are warm in our beds, with no iron rods sewn in our pajamas, no anonymous blackmail letters waiting in our mailboxes, and no double cousin marriages to negotiate. Sweet dreams. I hope you are feeling deeply relaxed, that your room is dark and quiet, and that you are ready to let your mind drift a little further into the comfortable, dusty corners of royal history. Tonight, we are going to explore some of the most extraordinary, bizarre, and downright awkward moments in the private lives of the European elite. If you thought the figures we have met so far were eccentric, the ones waiting for us tonight take things to a whole new level of instability. Instead, she began a passionate, highly public affair with Paul's best friend and closest advisor, the handsome Count Andrei Razumovsky. The entire Russian court knew about the affair, and Catherine the Great watched with quiet amusement as her son was publicly humiliated by his own wife and his best friend. But Paul was completely blind to the betrayal. He trusted Razumovsky implicitly and believed his wife was a saint. Then tragedy struck. In 1776, after 3 years of marriage, Natalia went into a long, agonizing labor. The baby was too large to pass through her narrow pelvis, and after 5 days of suffering, both the baby and Natalia died. Paul was absolutely devastated. His grief was monumental. He wept for days, refused to leave her body, and threatened to throw himself into her grave. But Catherine the Great had absolutely no patience for her son's dramatic grief. She wanted him to get over his wife and marry someone else as quickly as possible. So, to snap him out of his depression, Catherine did something of legendary cruelty. She walked into Paul's room carrying a secret mahogany chest that had been found in Natalia's private chambers. Inside the chest were dozens of highly detailed, highly passionate love letters between Natalia and Andrei Razumovsky, detailing their affair, their plans to run away together, and some very cruel jokes about Paul's appearance and his performance in bed. Catherine forced her son to sit down and read every single letter. It was a brutal, devastating blow. In a single afternoon, Paul's grief turned into complete, bitter betrayal. He realized that the woman he had worshipped had despised him and that his best friend had been sleeping with his wife. He banished Razumovsky from the court, refused to attend Natalia's funeral, and locked himself in his room for weeks. To secure the succession, Paul was immediately married off again, this time to the sweet, patient Sophia Dorothea of Württemberg, who took the name Maria Fedorovna. Maria was a wonderful wife who tolerated Paul's growing paranoia and gave him 10 children, but the betrayal of his first wife had permanently warped Paul's mind. When Catherine the Great died in 1996, Paul finally became Tsar Paul I. He immediately set out to undo everything his mother had ever done. He dug up his father Peter III's body from its quiet grave, had it crowned in a bizarre late-night ceremony, and forced the elderly nobles who'd helped Catherine murder his father to walk in the funeral procession behind the coffin carrying the crown. Paul then ran Russia with the strict, unyielding discipline of a military barracks. He was obsessed with Prussian military drills, and he forced the entire Russian army to wear uncomfortable, old-fashioned Prussian uniforms, including powdered wigs and tight breeches. He passed hundreds of bizarre, highly paranoid laws. He banned round hats, frock coats, and certain words from
from the Russian language, including the word society and the word citizen, which he believed were code words for a French-style revolution. He ordered that everyone in St. Petersburg must go to bed at 10 at night, and that when his royal carriage passed on the street, every citizen, regardless of their rank or the weather, must immediately get out of their carriage and kneel in the mud until he had passed. His paranoia reached its peak when he built St. Michael's Castle in St. Petersburg. It was a massive, grim fortress surrounded by a deep moat, drawbridges, and secret escape tunnels. Paul believed he would finally be safe behind its thick stone walls. But he was wrong. In March of 1801, after living in his new castle for just 40 days, a group of disgruntled army officers and nobles, supported by Paul's own son Alexander, snuck into the castle in the middle of the night. They burst into Paul's bedroom. The terrified Tsar tried to hide behind a heavy screen in the corner of the room, but the conspirators found him. They dragged him out, beat him with a gold snuff box, and strangled him to death with a silk sash. The next morning, it was announced that Paul had died of a sudden apoplexy, and the entire city of St. Petersburg erupted in celebration, drinking champagne in the streets to celebrate the end of the reign of the pug-faced military tyrant. Let's float over to another royal disaster, where a young princess from a very prominent family found out that her new husband was more interested in shooting live rodents in her bedchamber than in actually being a husband. Tonight, let's look at the grand, bizarre marriage of Grand Duke Konstantin Pavlovsky of Russia and his young bride, Juliana of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. Konstantin, born in 1779, was the younger brother of Tsar Alexander I and the grandson of Catherine the Great. He was named after Constantine the Great because his grandmother had a grand plan to conquer Constantinople and put her grandson on the throne of a restored Byzantine Empire. But Constantine had absolutely no desire to be an emperor or to behave with any form of royal dignity. He was incredibly violent, erratic, and had a childish, highly destructive personality. He looked remarkably like his father, Paul, with the same short, pug-like nose and nervous expression. And he shared his father's absolute obsession with military drills, drums, and parade grounds. In 1796, when Constantine was just 17 years old, Catherine the Great decided he needed to be married. She looked around the Protestant courts of Germany and chose Princess Juliana of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, who was just 14 years old. Juliana was a sweet, delicate girl who was completely unprepared for the brutal reality of the Russian court, and particularly for her new husband. The first meeting was a complete shock. Constantine was rude, ignored her, and spent his time playing with his toy soldiers. But the real nightmare began after the wedding, when they moved into the Marble Palace in St. Petersburg. Constantine treated his young wife not as a romantic partner, but as a plaything for his bizarre, childish, and often cruel games. He was obsessed with firearms and explosives. He would bring loaded pistols and muskets into their bedroom and spend hours shooting at targets on the walls or shooting at the plaster ceiling, filling the room with thick, acrid sulfur smoke and deafening noise. Juliana would sit on her bed, her hands over her ears, terrified that a stray bullet would hit her. But Constantine's favorite game was much bizarrer and highly dangerous. He had a massive, priceless Chinese porcelain vase in his apartments. He would force the young Juliana to crawl inside the vase, curl up at the bottom, and stay completely silent. Then he would take a small toy brass cannon loaded with real gunpowder and small lead balls and shoot at the vase from across the room, laughing hysterically as the lead balls chipped the porcelain directly above his wife. If she cried or tried to get out, Constantine would throw firecrackers at her feet or threaten to lock her in the cellar. When he wasn't shooting at his wife or playing with his dogs, he would force Juliana to sit in his study and watch him conduct military drills with his servants. He would beat a loud, deafening parade drum for hours at a time, directly next to her head, until her ears bled from the noise. Juliana's physical and mental health rapidly deteriorated. She became pale, thin, and suffered from constant, severe panic attacks. She begged her mother-in-law, Maria Fedorovna, for help, but Maria told her that she simply had to endure her husband's quirks for the sake of the dynasty. But Juliana had a survival instinct that was stronger than her fear of the Russian royal family. In 1801, after 5 years of living in a shooting gallery with a husband who beat drums and kept dogs in the bed, Juliana fell seriously ill with a fever. She managed to convince the royal doctors that the cold, damp climate of St. Petersburg was killing her and that she needed to go to a spa in Germany to recover. Constantine, who was getting bored of her plaything anyway, agreed
agreed to let her go. As soon as Juliana's carriage crossed the Russian border, she made a quiet, firm decision. She was never, under any circumstances, going back to Russia. She arrived in Germany, reunited with her family, and wrote a letter to Constantine stating that she was staying in Germany permanently. The Russian royal family was absolutely furious. They offered massive pensions, threatened to cut off her family's income, and sent diplomats to plead with her to return. But Juliana was stubborn.
She told them she would rather live in poverty for the rest of her life than spend another day in a room with Constantine and his toy cannons. She spent the rest of her life living quiet, independent, and highly peaceful life in Switzerland and Germany. Constantine went on to fight in the Napoleonic Wars, where his erratic, violent nature made him a highly controversial commander. In 1820, he finally agreed to grant Juliana an official divorce so he could marry a Polish noblewoman, Joanna Grudzińska, whom he actually loved. When his brother, Alexander I, died in 1925, Constantine was next in line throne, but he flatly refused to become Tsar, stating that he would rather be strangled like his father, Paul, than run the country. He passed the crown to his younger brother, Nicholas I, and died of cholera in 1831. So, as we drift off to sleep tonight, let's be glad that we are warm in our beds. No street gangs drinking beer in our bedrooms, no secret chests of love letters to break our hearts, and no toy cannons shooting at our porcelain vases. Sweet dreams. I hope your pillow is perfectly adjusted, your blankets are cozy, and you are ready to let your mind drift a little deeper into the slow, quiet rhythms of history. Tonight, we are going to explore some of the most extraordinary, bizarre, and darkly humorous moments in the private lives of European elite. If you thought the figures we have met so far were eccentric, the ones waiting for us tonight take things to a whole new level: creative cruelty, phantom intruders, and the most comfortable three-way political relationship in imperial history. So, let's close our eyes, take a deep, slow breath, and let the modern world fade away. Let's float over to 18th century Russia, where we will meet an empress whose reign was defined by extreme cold, a severe lack of empathy, and a wedding ceremony that was literally freezing. Tonight, let's talk about Empress Anna of Russia. Anna was the niece of Peter the Great, and her early life was a series of tragic, highly awkward events. In 1710, at the age of 17, she was married to Frederick William, the Duke of Courland. It was a purely political match, but the wedding celebrations in St. Petersburg were legendary for their excess. Her uncle, Peter the Great, loved to drink, and he forced the young groom to participate in a series of intense, multi-day drinking contests. This turned out to be a fatal mistake. The young Duke, on the journey back to Courland after the wedding, his liver, which had been severely abused by the Russian emperor's drinking contests, essentially gave out. He died of alcohol poisoning just a few miles outside St. Petersburg, leaving the 17-year-old Anna a widow after only a few weeks of marriage. Anna spent the next 20 years living in poverty and isolation in her damp, cold castle in Courland, ignored by the Russian royal family. But in 1730, the male line of the Romanov dynasty died out, and the Russian Supreme Privy Council looked around for a weak, easily manipulated royal who would let them run the country. They settled on Anna, believing she would be grateful for the crown and would sign away her royal powers. But as soon as Anna arrived in Moscow, she tore up the constitution they had written for her, dissolved the council, and declared herself the absolute autocratic empress of Russia. Anna's 20 years of poverty and loneliness had left her with a deep, bitter resentment of the nobility and a highly eccentric, cruel sense of humor. She filled her court with dwarf jesters, giant ladies-in-waiting, and a bizarre parade of eccentric companions. She loved to play practical jokes, and she spent her days sitting by her palace windows with a loaded rifle, shooting at random birds that flew across the courtyard. But Anna's masterpiece of creative cruelty occurred in the freezing winter of 1739. A high-ranking Russian nobleman, Prince Mikhail Alexeyevich Golitsyn, had committed the ultimate sin in Anna's eyes. While traveling abroad in Italy, he had fallen in love with an Italian woman, converted to Catholicism, and married her. When he returned to Russia, Anna was absolutely furious. She stripped him of his titles, confiscated his estates, and made him her personal court jester. She gave him the humiliating nickname Kwashnin, which referred to a bucket of sourdough, and forced him to perform ridiculous tricks for the amusement of her court. But Anna didn't finish his punishment. She decided that Prince Golitsyn needed a new,
suitable wife. She chose Avdotya Ivanovna Bujaninova, an old, remarkably ugly Kalmyk maid who worked in the palace. Anna named the maid Bujaninova after her favorite type of roasted pork dish, which tells you everything you need to know about how she viewed her servants. Anna declared that she would host a grand, state-funded wedding for her two favorite jesters, and because it was the coldest winter St. Petersburg had seen in decades, with temperatures dropping to -40 degrees, Anna decided to make the wedding a celebration of ice. She hired the country's leading architects and scientists to build a massive, highly detailed palace made entirely of ice on the frozen Neva River. The ice palace was 80 feet long, 33 feet high, and constructed of massive blocks of clear river ice that had been carved and fitted together with water, which froze instantly to act as cement. The level of detail was extraordinary and deeply unsettling. Outside the palace, there were ice trees with ice birds resting on the branches, ice dolphins that shot real water through their mouths during the day, and a life-sized ice elephant that squirted burning naphtha oil from its trunk at night. There were even functioning ice cannons that fired real ice balls using real gunpowder without shattering. Inside the palace, every single piece of furniture was carved from solid ice. There was an ice dining room with an ice table, ice chairs, and ice plates and cutlery. There was an ice drawing room with an ice clock and an ice deck of playing cards which had been painted on the ice. But the main attraction was the ice bedroom. In the bedroom, there was a massive ice bed, complete with an ice mattress, ice pillows, a heavy ice blanket, and even a pair of ice slippers and a nightcap resting on the bedside table. In February of 1740, the wedding took place. Anna organized a massive, bizarre procession of all the nations of the Russian Empire. Representatives from every ethnic group in Russia were forced to dress in their traditional costumes and parade through the freezing streets. Some rode on the backs of camels, others in carriages pulled by pigs, goats, or dogs. The bride and groom, Prince Golitsyn and the Kalmyk maid, were placed inside a large iron cage that was mounted on the back of a real elephant. After a grand freezing feast, the newlyweds were escorted to the ice palace. Anna's guards marched them into the ice bedroom, stripped them of their warm winter clothes, and forced them to lie down on the ice bed. The guards then locked the heavy ice doors of the palace, posted sentries outside, and left the couple to spend their wedding night on a block of solid ice in -40-degree weather. Anna believed they would freeze to death, which she thought would be a highly amusing end to the joke. But the bride, Avdotya Bujaninova, possessed a remarkable amount of survival instinct. Before she was escorted to the palace, she had secretly used some of the gold Anna had given her for the wedding to bribe one of the guards. In exchange, the guard had smuggled a thick, heavy sheepskin coat and some warm wool blankets into the ice palace, hiding them behind the ice curtains. As soon as the guards left, Avdotya retrieved the coat and the blankets. She and Prince Golitsyn wrapped themselves tightly together, using their shared body heat to survive the night on the frozen bed. The next morning, when the guards opened the ice doors, they were shocked to find the couple still alive, though suffering from severe frostbite. Anna was so impressed by their survival that she declared her anger was satisfied, restored some of their freedom, and allowed them to move into a quiet country estate, where they actually went on to have 2 children. Empress Anna died just a few months later, in October of 1740, from kidney stones. The ice palace slowly melted into the Neva River during the spring thaw, leaving behind only a cold, watery memory of one of the most eccentric and cruel weddings in royal history. Let's float over to another royal whose mind was as fragile as his brother's castles, and who spent his entire 27-year reign as a ghost in a luxury prison. Tonight, let's talk about King Otto of Bavaria. Otto was the younger brother of King Ludwig II, the fairy tale king we met in our previous journey. Like his brother, Otto was born with a delicate, highly sensitive nervous system and a deep love of music and poetry. But unlike Ludwig, who spent his youth building castles, Otto was forced to serve in the military.
In 1870, at the age of 22, Otto served as a high-ranking officer in the Franco-Prussian War. The brutal reality of the battlefield, the sound of cannon fire, and the sight of thousands of dead and wounded soldiers completely shattered Otto's fragile mind. He returned to Munich in a state of absolute mute shock. He began suffering from severe depression, anxiety, and intense hallucinations. His behavior became increasingly erratic. He would refuse to wear his military uniform, scream at invisible enemies, and spend hours pacing his rooms in silence. By 1872, the Bavarian royal doctors officially diagnosed Otto with schizophrenia, or systematized paranoia. He was deemed completely unfit to participate in public life and was quietly moved to Fürstenried Palace, a beautiful, secluded estate surrounded by lush forests just outside Munich. For the next 46 years, Otto lived as a prisoner of his own mind in that quiet palace. He was given a luxurious suite of rooms, a team of dedicated servants, and a group of royal doctors who monitored his daily routine. But Otto was completely detached from reality. He had no idea what was happening in the world, and he had no interest in his royal status. Then, in June of 1886, King Ludwig II died under those mysterious circumstances in Lake Starnberg. Because Ludwig had no children, his younger brother, the Mad Prince Otto, was officially declared King Otto I of Bavaria. It was one of the most bizarre situations in royal history. Bavaria was being run by a regent, Otto's uncle, Prince Luitpold, because the king was locked in an asylum and didn't even know he had been crowned. The palace staff tried to explain the news to Otto. They walked into his room, bowed low, and addressed him as Your Majesty. But Otto just looked at them with complete blankness, barked like a dog, and turned back to his window. He spent his entire 27-year reign without ever signing a single document, delivering a speech, or wearing his royal crown. Otto's daily life at Fürstenried Palace was a series of highly repetitive, eccentric, and occasionally comical habits. He had an intense obsession with leather. He refused to wear normal royal fabrics like silk or velvet, and insisted on wearing heavy leather boots, leather trousers, and leather jackets, even in the middle of a hot summer. He believed that leather was the only thing that could protect him from the bad air and the electrical currents that his invisible enemies were shooting at him. He also developed a deep hatred of cups and plates. Whenever his servants would bring him his meals on delicate porcelain, Otto would fly into a rage, grab the plates, and smash them against the stone walls. To keep him from breaking everything in the palace, the staff had to start serving his meals on heavy wooden platters and in pewter cups that couldn't be broken. But Otto's most famous and most challenging habit was his daily hunt for phantom intruders. Otto became convinced that his bedroom was regularly invaded by hidden spies and enemy soldiers who were hiding behind the curtains or under his bed. To protect himself, he had his doctors provide him with a pair of antique, unloaded pistols. Every morning, Otto would wake up, grab his pistols, and conduct a thorough sweep of his rooms. He would jump out from behind doors, kick the heavy curtains, and fire his unloaded pistols at the empty corners of the room, shouting, "Aha! I have you now, Prussian spy." To pacify him and make him feel safe, his doctors and servants had to play along with the game. Whenever Otto fired his unloaded pistols, the nearest doctor or servant was expected to clutch their chest, groan in agony, and fall dramatically onto the floor, pretending to be dead. Otto would look at them with great satisfaction, blow the imaginary smoke from his pistols, and say, "Excellent, take him to the cellar." Only after he had killed several intruders would he agree to sit down and eat his breakfast. Despite his severe mental illness, Otto's physical health was remarkably robust. He spent his days walking in the palace gardens, smoking vast quantities of cigarettes, sometimes up to 30 a day, and listening to the wind through the trees. He outlived his uncle, the regent, Luitpold, and when a new regent, Ludwig III, decided to officially declare himself king in 1913, the constitution had to be changed so that Bavaria would have two kings simultaneously because Otto was still alive. Otto died in October of 1916 at the age of 68 from a sudden bowel obstruction. He had been a king on paper for almost 30 years, but he spent his entire life in a world of his own making, far away from the wars, the politics, and the dynastic duties that had destroyed his family. Let's float over to a sunny Spanish court where a king was so completely uninterested in ruling that he willingly handed his country, his crown, and his own wife to a handsome royal guardsman whom he treated as his best friend. Tonight, let's talk about the comfortable, highly bizarre three-way relationship of King Charles IV of Spain, Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, and Manuel de Godoy. King Charles IV became the King of Spain in 1788. He was a large, gentle, and
remarkably simple-minded man. He had absolutely no interest in politics, statecraft, or the complex affairs of his vast empire. Instead, Charles had two major passions in life: hunting and fixing clocks. He would wake up early every morning, spend 6 hours hunting in the royal forests, eat a massive lunch, and then spend the rest of his day in his workshop surrounded by gears, springs, and clock faces, trying to repair his extensive collection of French clocks. He famously remarked that running a country was far too stressful, and he would much rather be a simple clockmaker. His wife, Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, was the exact opposite. She was a strong, dominant, and highly ambitious woman who possessed a sharp mind and a fierce desire for power. She quickly realized that her husband was more than happy to let her run the government as long as she didn't interrupt his clockmaking. But Maria Luisa didn't want to run the country alone. She needed a trusted ally and a romantic companion. She found both in Manuel de Godoy. Godoy was a young, incredibly handsome officer in the royal bodyguard. He came from a minor, impoverished noble family, but he possessed a massive amount of charm, ambition, and a highly pleasing physical appearance. In 1788, at the age of 21, Godoy caught the eye of the queen. Within a few months, he became her official lover. Now, in most royal courts, a queen taking a young guardsman as her lover would lead to a major scandal, secret arrests, or a sudden, mysterious death. But the Spanish court under Charles IV was not a normal court. Charles didn't mind the affair at all. In fact, he was absolutely thrilled. He fell in love with Godoy too, not romantically, but as a best friend. Charles was incredibly lonely, and he found in Godoy a warm, attentive, and highly companionable friend who loved hunting just as much as he did. Charles would invite Godoy to all their family dinners, write him sweet, affectionate letters, and refer to him as my dear friend or my brother. The relationship between the three of them was incredibly comfortable and highly organized. Maria Luisa got her romantic partner and her political ally. Godoy got a massive amount of wealth, titles, and political power, eventually being appointed as the Prime Minister of Spain. And Charles got to spend all his time hunting and fixing clocks, knowing that his beloved wife and his best friend were taking care of the boring government business. It was the ultimate cozy three-way partnership. Whenever the three of them traveled, they would ride in the same carriage, share the same dining table, and live in adjacent suites of rooms. Charles would actually boast to foreign diplomats about how wonderful his friend Godoy was and how lucky Spain was to have such a brilliant prime minister. But when the Spanish public began to riot against Godoy because of his highly corrupt, pro-French policies, Charles was genuinely devastated. He couldn't understand why his subjects were being so mean to his favorite friend. He actually wrote to the King of France complaining that his poor friend Manuel was being picked on by the bad Spanish people. But this cozy domestic bliss was destroyed by a much more ruthless, ambitious player, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon looked at the Spanish royal family and realized that they were a complete joke. He saw a simple-minded king who fixed clocks, a queen who was obsessed with her young lover, and a prime minister who was easily manipulated. In 1808, Napoleon tricked the entire Spanish royal family, Charles, Maria Luisa, and Godoy, into traveling to France for a peace conference. As soon as they arrived in Bayonne, Napoleon arrested them, forced Charles to abdicate his throne, and placed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. Charles was shocked and confused by the betrayal. He couldn't understand why his good friend Napoleon was being so rude, but even in exile, the three-way partnership remained unbroken. Napoleon placed Charles, Maria Luisa, and Godoy under house arrest in a beautiful chateau in France. They lived together in peace, sharing their meals, their gardens, and their quiet retirement. When Napoleon was defeated in 1914, they moved